Hello, welcome to Capturing Christianity. Cameron Bertuzzi here, live with Jimmy Akin, and we're doing a call-in show. This is our very first call-in show that we've ever done on Capturing Christianity, so I'm a little bit stressed right now, just letting you know, giving you a quick update. A little bit stressed just because the software, like trying to do new things and stuff. I want to make sure that this runs smoothly and everything, so please forgive me if we have some sort of technical issue. We did some tests and stuff, so we should be okay. But the topic for this stream is the afterlife, and there's actually kind of three subtopics that we'll be looking at today and taking calls on. So we're going to be discussing deathbed visions, or DBVs, basically what happens before a person dies. Number two is near-death experiences, or NDEs, as they're commonly referred to. That's some sort of experience during which a person is clinically dead, so near-death experience. And then after-death communications, or ADCs, which occur after a person dies. So we're going to split this video or this episode into sort of three different subcategories, and we'll be taking questions. I mean, I assume that we'll get questions on topics all sort of still hopefully related to the afterlife, but we're just going to kind of play it by ear and just have a lot of fun today. So, Jimmy, welcome back to Capturing Christianity.
Yeah, thanks. Always glad to be here. And as you mentioned, we have a special purpose for this week. Now, this week is one big week-long event. This is the first time that Capturing Christianity is taking calls via Zoom. And you can find the Zoom link down in the video description. So, this is an exciting thing. We also have picked very significant guests who have very interesting topics to talk about. So this is going to be a really exciting week that we have lined up for you. There's also a special purpose for it. As Cameron and I shared on a video that came out yesterday, Capturing Christianity has been a little delinquent in its fundraising, in part for various reasons. But like one of them is Cameron's had a new baby, which is awesome. But new babies take you away from your regular schedule, as you know, if you ever had a new baby. And that's made it a little harder to do the kind of normal routine fundraising that ministries need to do in order to stay in the black. So now we're in a catch-up mode. We need to do some more intense fundraising right now to compensate for the fundraising that didn't happen earlier. The plan is, so right now, as we shared in the initial video, Capturing Christianity is operating at a deficit, and we've got about 5 months worth of funding in the bank. But if that goes to zero, and this is what we're here to prevent, but if it were to go to zero, basically Cameron would have to find a new job. And he wouldn't be able to do Capturing Christianity anymore, at least not on the consistent way he's been doing it, because he's got a growing family to feed. And so what we need to do is get into a break-even perspective. Cameron, what's the exact amount of money that we need to raise total from this fundraising drive?
Sorry about that. I just finished lunch, basically the total amount that we need to raise, and we'll see how much progress we make this week on this. But total amount roughly around $4,000 a month. So okay. I mean, we've been very fortunate that we've had money in the bank during this deficit. But as we mentioned in the video that we did together a day or so ago, the bank funds, you can't operate forever at a deficit, right? So nonprofits, you've got to fundraise. And I was explaining in that video as well that we can't rely the size of the channel. We can't rely on ad revenue from Google to basically sustain like the funds or the expenses of the ministry. So that's one of the reasons why channels like us, Apologetics channels, we rely on Patreon to fund our operations. We can't just rely on ad revenue, because part of it is because we talk about topics and subjects are a little bit deeper, and they don't interest everyone, obviously.
A lot deeper.
Yeah, a lot deeper. And our views we get less views than some of the other channels, even on Apologetics, that cover more mainstream topics. But because we go deeper, we get less views, which means less ad revenue, which means that we rely on crowdfunding you guys to support our ministry, make sure that this continues to operate. And as Jimmy mentioned, I just haven't been able to raise funds at the level that we really need to in order to maintain the level of support, because as you mentioned in the other video, Jimmy, there's a thing called attrition, which is basically over time donors drop off, which is a very normal thing that happens with nonprofit organizations. But in order to
often due to credit card renewal, one credit
Yeah.
credit cards only last for a certain amount of time, and then they change, and it can be a problem to get the new credit card information into the system, even if the person still wants to be a supporter. So attrition is a real problem. All nonprofits deal with it, and the pleasantest way to deal with it is by regular, routine, low-level fundraising, which is what we want to do in the future. But when you're in a deficit situation, I've always said the thing to do is be honest with the donors. Don't hype it up and make it sound worse than it is. Don't diminish it and make it sound like it's less than it is, but just be honest. The honest thing is we have 5 months worth of funding in the bank right now. But the good news is we've got 5 months to fix that. And it's imminently doable. As we talked in the other video, if we got 160 new patrons at the $25 a month level, the problem would be solved. And so this is imminently doable, especially in 5 months. The even better news is we've already started to see results just from that first video. We still have a long way to go, but we were very pleased by the initial results. It really was encouraging to Cameron and to me that we're on a path that will get us where we need to go, but we're going to need your help to do that. And in exchange for your help, we have some thank you gifts that we'd like to send you. Cameron, can you tell us about the different thank you gifts that we have for people who see the value in the work you're doing and want to help it continue?
Absolutely. So we, at any amount of giving that you want to sign up for at our Patreon, which I've got that linked directly below. If you just hit the description box, you'll get a link directly to our Patreon, or you can go to patreon.com/capturing Christianity. But the first thing that you'll get, any amount of support that you give, if it's $1, $2, $5, $25, whatever you'd like to support Capturing Christianity at, you're going to get access to a PDF that was created by a supporter of the ministry, which is basically a summary of why you should believe, why really everyone should believe that the Gospels are reliable. It's a fantastic resource. Again, I was talking about this in the other video. It's such a good resource because it sort of summarizes the current dialectic. It summarizes all of the arguments that are made in defense of gospel reliability, from undesigned coincidences. It talks about contradictions. It talks about textual criticism. So it's just a fantastic resource. You guys definitely want to get your hands on this. Again, it's available as a PDF to anyone that signs up. You can sign up right now, get access to it, read through it, and then get all the other resources that are mentioned in there as well. So that's the first thing. Everyone gets that if you sign up and support the ministry. At the $25 amount, which is the sort of tier that we're kind of targeting for this, as Jimmy mentioned, like if we had 160 people sign up at the $25 amount, which actually isn't that big of a number relative to the total number of people that watch our videos. So on average, I think we average around, let's say, 20 to 50,000 views per video that we post. Some of our videos obviously get way more than that. Some of them get less, but on average, 20 to 50,000. So we only need like a small portion of you guys that watch our content and find value in it to come and support the ministry so that we can continue to do this. But at the $25 amount, we've got this book that we're giving away. And this is on top of what we're already giving at the $25 tier on Patreon. So anyone that signs up is going to get access to this book. It's a soft cover. I wish it was available in hardcover. We would give this out, but excuse me. We've got this one is authored by Pat Flynn, who actually just got accepted into a PhD program. It's got such high praises, basically from literally everyone who's read this has given it such high praise. Josh Rasmussen, who's been on the channel, he gives this one high praise. Everyone in the philosophy community, even atheists, are saying that this is a really, really good book. And so I wanted to, I reached out to Pat. We've got a deal with the publisher to be able to give these to you guys at that amount. And yeah, so everyone that signs up at the $25 tier gets access to the PDF and the book. And then at the $50 tier, this is something new. This is something we've never done before. We've given out books in the past, and books are always coming out, so that's fun and stuff. But this is something you literally can't get anywhere. I've done videos on the Shroud of Turin in the past with Andrew Dalton, with other people, and I actually intend on doing more of them. But we're giving this away at the $50 amount, which is a basic. It's a statue of Jesus based on the Shroud of Turin. So on this, if I can kind of get the camera to zoom in here or focus on this, you've got the wounds on Jesus. That this is created by a guy named Matthew Collins. And he worked really closely with an artist who looked really closely at the shroud to make this as accurate as possible to the Shroud of Turin. And it's made out of bronze and steel. So it's super good quality.
I think that's important to point out. This is not cheap 3D printed plastic. This is quality material that's meant to last. And you can hang this statue on your wall. It's designed to do that.
It's 12 inches long. And this is the only statue based on the Shroud of Turin in existence. Like, you can't get this anywhere else. The only other ones are available that, like, they're full size. Like, museums have them, some churches have them, but this is the first statue that's made based on the image that we find in the Shroud of Turin in the size that can basically fit on a bookshelf. You can hang it on your wall, and we're giving this out to new patrons that sign up at excuse me, at the $50 tier. So at the $50 tier, if you'd like to support us and help us get out of this situation that we're currently in, we're going to give you the PDF, we're going to give you the book, and you're going to receive this awesome statue. So yeah, that's what we have set up and going on.
And as Cameron mentioned, the way you can do all of that is by just looking in the description below the video. It will have a link to Patreon so that you can go there and become a regular monthly patron. Also, and we use Patreon because it's a standard and a lot of people use it and they're comfortable using it. Not everyone's a fan of Patreon, so we also have another service. If you don't like Patreon, we have another service called Donor Box, and we'll have links to that as well. So whatever your preferred means is, we want to help make it easy for you to be able to support the channel, because what Cameron's doing is rare. It is quality apologetics work. There are a lot of apologetic channels that frankly are amateurish, and there are a lot of apologetic channels that use bad self-serving arguments, and there are a lot of apologetic channels that are filled with a bad attitude of just, kind of tribal chest thumping and rally the troops and rah, but they're not trying to look at issues deeply and open-mindedly and in a fair and balanced way. So what you've got here on Capturing Christianity is rare in the apologetics world. And that's one of the reasons that I'm here to try to help support it and help it get where it needs to be and grow. And there are even more plans to expand in the future and do new types of content, like in-person interviews and documentaries and stuff like that, that'll add even more value to Capturing Christianity. Furthermore, some of the donors we already have aren't even Christian. They're non-Christian. Some of them are atheists, but they see the value of the kinds of discussions and the kind of content that Capturing Christianity provides, and they want to support it, and so they do. So if you're a believer and you see the value of what's happening here, please do help it continue. We do need your support at this time to help us get out of this deficit situation, but I have confidence that we're going to get there.
So let's go ahead and turn now to the topic, which is we're talking about heaven, and we're taking your calls. So if you would like to join, there's a link in the description of this video that's basically a link to Zoom. You can join our Zoom Hangout, and then I can bring you into our show to talk with Jimmy. We've got one guy already lined up. His name is Kevin. I think is the last name that he goes by is Non-Contradiction?
Non-Traddy Cath.
Non-Traddy Cath. Okay. I've always read that as non-contradiction. I don't know why. But he's been on the show. I've actually met him in person when I traveled over to where was that? Kevin can tell us in a second. I literally can't even remember where I traveled and met him. It was at the Asbury Revival, but I can't remember what city that was in. Anyways, we'll talk to Kevin in just a minute. He's got some. He's not a Christian, but he's got some questions about the afterlife. We'll talk with Jimmy about that. But I did want to actually cover some super chats that were sent in. So we have people that are wanting to support the ministry through super chats, which you're also welcome to do if you'd like to support us that way. So this one from Mihoville. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Here is some help to you. This is completely off topic, but I would love to discuss with Jimmy a theory I have been working on that is defense of perpetual virginity based on biological facts. Any thoughts,
if you'd care to send it to me via email, I'd be happy to take a look at it. I'm not sure how quickly I could get to it, but you're welcome to send it to me by email, and I can give you some thoughts.
Excellent. Thank you for the super chat. All right, let's move on to another one. We've got a few here. Marius5 says, doing my best to support your ministry. My question is, how well do you both think the Kalam argument fares today against criticism? Very good question. So for those of you that don't know, the Kalam, what he's referring to is an argument for God's existence that basically it falls under the category of a cosmological argument, which basically looks at some sort of like broad feature of the universe. So for example, in this case, we're thinking about the beginning of the universe. And the Kalam is primarily focused on whether or not the universe had a beginning and whether or not that provides evidence for the existence of God. There's different ways to cash that out. Some versions of the Kalam don't necessarily have as a premise that the universe began to exist. Instead, it'll say there is a first cause, and then it'll argue that first cause has to be God. That's actually the version that I like the best. But some recent work that was done on the Kalam stems from a guy named Alexander Preuss. Another guy working on it is Rob Koons, and they've developed these series of arguments that were originally sort of coined. The term was a Grim Reaper paradox. So basically, there's these paradoxes that seem to imply that, at least when it comes to causes, you can't have an infinite series of causes in any causal history. So like if you think about all the different causes that have happened in our universe, say, if you go backwards in time, that backwards timeline can't go on forever when it comes to at least the number of causes that there are when you look into the backward history of the universe. And what he argues in his work based on this sort of paradox is that there's basically got to be a first cause. You can't have, so it's called causal finitism. So there's a finite number of total causes that can exist. And so it's some of the latest work on it, and there are some objections right now that are kind of being floated, but it's the dialectic on this is a little bit new, so the literature is still sort of being developed. But overall, to kind of answer the question, go back to it, I think that in general, I think the Kalam is a good argument. I think that there are good arguments in defense of the Kalam. There's different ways to formulate the Kalam so that you can avoid certain criticisms that are leveled against the Kalam. So overall, I think it's a good, decent argument for the existence of God. I think Jimmy actually has some dissenting thoughts on this, but Jimmy, I'm curious to hear what you have to say.
Well, yeah, I think we may have somewhat of a different appraisal here, but that's what philosophers do. They look at the arguments and the evidence, and they see what seems most plausible to them. I do use the Kalam argument, but I think that it has to be handled in a careful way. The formulation of it that I like is kind of the classical recent one of everything that has a beginning has a cause. The universe has a beginning, therefore the universe has a cause, which would be God. And I think all those premises are true. I think that it's a logically valid argument, and I think the premises are true. So I think it's a sound argument. My question, though, is how best to defend the key premises, and especially the premise that the universe has a beginning. Now, we have some good scientific evidence for that, but the findings of science are always provisional, so they don't lead to ontological certainty, but they do allow one to have provisional confidence. And so I don't have a problem with scientific arguments for the universe having a finite history. Where my criticism would be of some of the work that's been done in this area is I have yet to find a philosophical defense of that premise that I consider to be successful. I tend to agree with St. Thomas Aquinas, and I want to who disagreed with this. By the way, there's been a division of opinion. Like St. Bonaventure thought that the Kalam worked. St. Thomas Aquinas thought it didn't work. And so there's been a split on this historically. On this issue, even though I'm not a Thomist, I tend to think Aquinas was right. And being a believer in God's omnipotence, I always want to say, well, God can do something unless I can show a logical contradiction in it. So God can realize any state of affairs except ones that involve logical contradictions, like four-sided triangles or circles that have square perimeters. Those are just contradictions. They're logical nonsense. And so God can't actualize those, but he could actualize anything else. And I have yet to find, and I know about like the Grim Reaper paradoxes and stuff, I have yet to find a a line of argumentation that I think shows that the idea of an infinite history involves a contradiction. And therefore, I think God could actualize one if he had chosen. So I tend to position the Kalam argument more along provisional scientific lines than philosophical lines, but I think it can be used. I think the premises are true and the argumental form is valid. And so the argument is fundamentally sound.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think over time, I would probably say that there are stronger pieces of evidence for the existence of God, apart from the universe or I guess reality or existence having some sort of first cause or needing a first cause. Because you've got to connect that first cause. If you can argue that there is a first cause, you've got to connect that to God in some way. Because some atheists will even accept that there's a first cause, but then argue that it's natural or not personal or something along those lines. And so you've still got work to do, even if you can establish that. But I think there are other things like fine-tuning, psychophysical harmony. If that's the first time you're ever hearing that, go look that up. Go look up psychophysical harmony on YouTube right now. Go watch an interview about that argument. Super interesting.
They're a great dance band. Psychophysical harmony. They are awesome.
No, it literally is like maybe the most powerful argument ever developed for the existence of God. You guys got to go check that out. So I think that there are stronger pieces of evidence for God that we could appeal to. But yeah, let's leave it at that. Let's leave it at that and move on. We can get into the topic of heaven. We did have a couple more super chats. These will go pretty quickly. Just kind of saying thank you. I wish you were able to give consistently, but here's a little drop in the tank. Thank you so much. Someone you may know. I don't know who you are, but I may know you. So
yeah,
thank you.
Thank you for your generosity.
Mihoville, I think, said it earlier. He sent in a super chat earlier. Thank you, Cam and Jimmy. Thank you so much for supporting us and being here with us. All right. So we have some people lined up in Zoom right now. As I mentioned, we've got Kevin, who is basically ready to go. But at first, what we need to do is have Jimmy. We're as I mentioned at the beginning of the show, so if you're just joining us, we're talking about whether or not heaven is real. But there's three different sort of subtopics we'll be discussing. So we'll be discussing deathbed visions, near-death experiences, and then after-death communications. And all of these are tied in to whether or not there is such thing as an afterlife. So let's start with the category, the first subcategory, deathbed visions. I'm going to turn it over to Jimmy now to give us some of the scientific details and facts surrounding deathbed visions that helps give us some sort of evidence that the afterlife exists. And then we'll turn it over to your calls and get our first skeptic on the phone with Jimmy.
Okay. So deathbed visions are a phenomenon that has been occurring all the way down through human history. And there are many records of deathbed visions occurring in historical documents. Basically, shortly before a person dies, they may begin to experience some unusual phenomena. They may begin to hear music that is pleasant. They may see a bright light. They may see departed loved ones that come to welcome them into the afterlife or even call them into the afterlife. And this is, like I said, this has been documented for centuries. Sometimes they get knowledge of things they didn't know before, including information about the future. I was reading Pope Gregory the Great's dialogues, and he notices that sometimes people who are dying get information about the future. And he proposes two causes for that. One cause is a subtle power of the human soul. So actually, which is today what we would call precognition, a psychic ability. So believe it or not, historically, there are figures in the Christian tradition who believed in psychic powers, including doctors of the church like Gregory the Great, St. Augustine, St. Thomas Aquinas. But he also says that it can come also to them by way of a vision, when just before a person is going to die. And he gives some examples of this, but we have much more recent ones. In the late 19th century, the study of deathbed visions really started to become organized along with the field of parapsychology. Parapsychology studies two principal areas. One is psychic functioning, and the other is survival of human consciousness beyond bodily death. And so this fell into the second of those categories. And you had individuals beginning to collect reports of deathbed visions, and they started looking at them for what do they involve, what are their commonalities, and so forth. And they began to consider, what evidence do they provide regarding the existence of an afterlife? And there have been a number of major studies of this that, if people want, I can give literature recommendations for. But basically, they noticed that the deathbed visions do intend to involve a given set of elements. There's light, there's music, there are departed loved ones who appear, or sometimes angels who appear. They sometimes see into the other world. They may perceive a barrier between our world and there, or they may not. They may see the two worlds as integrated. And this is very different than hallucinations that happen due to physical causes, like or drugs. A lot of these were before we had modern pharmaceuticals, and so people were heading to their death without any pain relief, but they would still see these visions. And when people began to be drugged, or when they started to just hallucinate, it was noted that hallucinations tend to be much more random. They're more like dreams. They don't involve this standard set of elements. And they tend to be nightmarish. People will hallucinate that they're being attacked by monsters, or that they have bugs crawling on their skin, or stuff like that. And these deathbed visions were not like that at all. They were very tranquil. Often a person's physical pain just shut off as the person was having the deathbed vision. And in some cases, they reported knowledge coming to them through the deathbed vision that later turned out to be true, and that exceeded random chance in terms of what you could guess. So that, in parapsychology, is known as veridical information. It's information that the participants in an experience did not previously have, that could not be reasonably guessed by random chance, but that turns out to be true. And that would imply, since it can't just be due to random chance, that would imply that something genuinely paranormal is happening here. This person has access now to information they shouldn't have. And there are examples of that in the deathbed vision literature, which I'll be happy to share, but I know we want to take some callers, so why don't we do that? And maybe one of them will ask me for some examples of that.
All right, let's get to it. Let's bring in Kevin now. Let me go ahead and ask him to unmute. Let me see if I can get him. There we go, on Zoom. Pull up the scene now. We've got him here with us. Let's just test your microphone, Kevin. Make sure we can hear you.
Hey, how do I sound?
You sound great. Good. You look great.
Good to see you again, Kevin.
Good to see you too, Jimmy and Cameron. So, hi, everyone. This is Kevin Non-Tradicaf. The last name is made up. So in that sense, any way that you choose to pronounce it is the correct way. I'm from Lexington, Kentucky. That's where Cam and I met, I guess, over a year ago at this point, right?
Yeah.
But I'm thrilled to have this opportunity to ask Jimmy about some NDE stuff. I'm a big fan of both Capturing Christianity and of Jimmy's work, whether that's on Mysterious World, Catholic Answers, or anywhere else that you find Jimmy. Jimmy was super generous to me, and we had a long conversation about 6 months ago. You can find that on Jimmy's channel. But here is my question on NDEs. I will assert that NDEs shouldn't really be used as evidence for the afterlife, for disconnected consciousness, or really much of anything, due to what I'm going to call the immature level of research. And here by immature, I do not mean childlike. I only mean that there's not sufficient research at this time. A 1996 article published in the Journal of the Royal Society of Medicine, succinctly named Near-Death Experiences, concluded that NDEs deserve some serious research, but then ends on the pessimistic note that, quote, study of life at its last limits may tell us more about ourselves and our lives than it does about our death. Well, in the subsequent 24 years, how much progress was made into the study of NDEs? Well, evidently not as much as we would like. The 2020 article, published as an opinion piece in Trends of Cognitive Sciences, titled Near-Death Experience as a Probe to Explore Disconnected Consciousness, concludes that at present, we have a limited understanding of NDE phenomenon, and it adds that same kind of pessimistic note. Like any other episode of Disconnected Consciousnesses, classical NDEs are challenging for research. So my question is this, Jimmy, do you think that the data that we have now is sufficient to come to any kind of conclusion? And do you expect that if we were able to perform like double-blind, placebo-controlled experiments about NDEs, would we find anything interesting that you think like would maybe be unexpected? And a few last notes. Congratulations, Cameron, on the growing family. Congratulations, Jimmy, on your recent health and fitness goals. And I was able to donate in about 60 seconds from my phone while I was backstage. It's super easy to do. It's a great cause. And even if you're an agnostic like me, I just want to encourage you to support. Iron sharpens iron, and I rely on ministries like Cameron's to keep my iron sharp. So I wanted to support the cause. All right. Thank you both very much. And that's it for me.
Wow. That's
Thank
amazing.
you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's awesome. So
before you come in, Jimmy, actually, I wanted to make a quick note. So Kevin, this goes for you and for anyone else that joins the call today. Don't leave right away. Kevin, I know you've got somewhere to be a little bit later. So if you can, just stick around. So after you ask your questions, you're obviously free to interact with Jimmy a little bit more. So don't feel like you've got to like drop your question and then head out. So just wanted to make that note before Jimmy comes in.
And my meeting was rescheduled, so I can actually hang out for as long as we need. So
okay, perfect.
Yeah.
Okay, so
right,
in terms of the basic question, now in any developing field of inquiry in science, you're absolutely right. There is a kind of preliminary stage where not much is known about the phenomenon under investigation, and we don't want to draw super firm conclusions during that phase of research. You want to wait and see what further data collection is going to reveal. In terms of near-death experience research, there were some preliminary researches that were done, and we're kind of talking about the second topic, so this is not deathbed visions, but there were some preliminary research done on near-death experiences throughout much of the 20th century, but it didn't really crystallize until 1975 with the release of Raymond Moody's book Life After Life. That's what really kicked off the near-death experience research. And in the 50 years now since that book came out, we've collected a lot of near-death data. There are challenges, you're quite correct, in doing research on it, like randomized double-blind controlled experiments are basically impossible with near-death experiences for ethical reasons, because you can't kill somebody to find out what kind of near-death experience they're going to have. You can't employ those kind of controls. And so we have a limited set of research tools, but that's expanding. And there have been some, like, for example, studies like the AWARE study and the AWARE-2 study that have tried to, go into the field and do research as quickly as possible, even in the hospital. Like, one of the planned elements of this is because people who experience NDEs frequently will have a phenomenon known as autoscopy, which is where you see yourself from an outside perspective. And they frequently report looking down from the room of the hospital where the technicians and doctors are trying to restart their heart and report what they see. Well, as part of what's called the AWARE study, which stands for like awareness during recitation, or something like that, they thought, let's put iPads up on ledges high in the room and have them display images. And then we can ask the people if they had autoscopy looking down on themselves, did you notice any images on the iPads? And that could serve as a source of veridical information. Unfortunately, the way the study has worked, they got very few people who ended up surviving their heart attack and who reported autoscopy and so forth. So the data set there is not robust enough to really draw any conclusions on that particular issue. But I think it's a fascinating idea for how to apply new research tools to this area. When it comes to the phenomenon as a whole, we've just got a lot of evidence for it now. And I think that even though we are still at a fairly early stage of research, we are 50 years into it, and we have numerous case reports that contain not just interesting information, but specifically veridical information the participants did not know before they had their heart attack or other clinical death experience. They came back knowing it, and it turned out to be true. And there's no plausible way that they could have learned about it while they were clinically dead. There's a recent book, if you're interested in this, it's by a group of European researchers, including the lead author is Titus Rivas. The book is called The Self Does Not Die. And what it does is it contains over 100 cases of NDEs where vertical information was retrieved and there's an independent witness. So it's not simply someone reporting it. There's someone else who was there and able to, like, for example, observe the experience and what the person was doing in the hospital. So you have some independent validation of the fact this person had no way of coming up with this information. To give just one example, and I have numerous others that I could give, but to give just one example, there is one vertical case where the person dies, he has his heart attack, his heart stops, he does have autoscopy, so he's looking down on himself from a higher up perspective, and he sees the doctors working on him. And he saw what looked to him like one doctor flapping his arms like a chicken. And he didn't know what is with this. Why is this doctor flapping his arms like a chicken? That's not a standard medical procedure. Well, they get his heart restarted, and then he shares his experience. And he talks to the doctor, and the doctor actually gets indignant and tells him, well, at least I brought you back. Well, it turned out that this which is not always, it's actually funny. In some of these cases, I'm aware of doctors and nurses who have gotten socked in the nose for bringing people back. They were having such a great time on the other side, they didn't want to come back. But it turns out that this particular doctor was a Japanese gentleman, and he, in the surgical theater, would keep his hands close to his chest in order to not get them contaminated by touching unsanitized objects. And what he would do, this was just his personal quirk, is he would point with his elbows to different pieces of equipment to tell the nurses what to get. And so it turns out that, yeah, this guy flapping his arms, looking kind of like a chicken in the surgical theater, was exactly what this guy did. That was a valid perception that the experiencer, who was clinically dead at the time, had no natural way of seeing. And when you read case after case, like I said, this book, The Self Does Not Die, contains more than 100 of these cases. I think even though we're not at 5 sigma level yet, to use a statistical term that's considered the gold threshold, the gold standard in physics, I think we have very substantial reason to think that NDEs do point to an afterlife. And I expect that further research in this area is likely to cause that evidence to continue to mount.
Yeah, I guess if I just can say a few things, I guess first, thank you for the generous and long answer. I guess second, I certainly am impressed by stories like that. But I guess I just have worries for like a few different reasons. There's been, various prophecies throughout history that we found out were made after the fact. And sometimes I worry that these NDE stories are embellished after the fact, or I saw you waving your arms around turned into I saw you flapping your arms like a chicken, which is maybe a little bit, things like that. I also worry about cases like the famous The Boy Who Came Back from Heaven case. There was that book. And like the kid who died and went to heaven and came back and allegedly told his father all these stories about heaven. When the kid got old enough,
Kevin Malarkey.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, you more about this than I do, but I guess I just worry about things like that. And I'm an engineer by education, so I'm a little bit of like a in God we trust. All others must bring data. So until I see the data on NDEs, I'm kind of thinking that I ought to remain agnostic. I don't know if you think that's kind of unreasonable, or that's just kind of I guess that's where I'm at, if that makes sense.
Okay. Well, no, I mean, what status you have, whether you're a disbeliever, a believer, or an agnostic, is going to be rationally based on what evidence you've seen. And if based on the evidence you've seen thus far, you're in the agnostic category, I think that's fine. I also think you raise legitimate concerns that need to be taken into account in doing research in this area. Elaboration and even outright hoaxing are possible. And those need, I'll give you one rule of thumb. It's only a rule of thumb, but one rule of thumb I use is if a single book is written by a reported NDE experiencer about their experience, and it's not like a collection of experiences, but they've got this one experience that they think they can mine an entire book out of, that is a very atypical NDE, and I am immediately suspicious of that book. And there are multiple examples. I can name 3 people off the top of my head that I think were hoaxers: Betty Eadie, Kevin Malarkey, who later fessed up, and Daniel Brinkley. I think all 3 of those were just outright hoaxers. And they all wrote books focused on their own experience. What I have more confidence in is case study collections that were made by researchers looking not just at one person who could be hoaxing, but at multiple people. And where, especially like in The Self Does Not Die, that where there is some independent validation of the claims. So it's not simply one person claiming this happened with no independent validation. So I think your concerns are legitimate, and I think they are being taken into account by serious NDE researchers. And I would just encourage you, if it's a topic you're interested in, get into the data more. Read The Self Does Not Die, or other books I could recommend that meet much higher standards than these like independently solo story books.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jimmy. I really appreciate you taking the time to answer this question so thoroughly. I'll happily hand the microphone off to the next question asker so that I don't take up the entire show today.
Great to see you, Kevin.
Thanks, Jimmy.
Thanks, Kev. Okay, we're going to turn now to some more super chats that were sent in. So we've got one from Truthseeker. He says, which specific scientific study provides the best evidence for an afterlife? Looking for the specific study, please.
Well, I would say that in any field of science, it's very rare that a single study supports something as major as the afterlife. I mean, that's a little bit like saying, which study best supports the theory of relativity? There was the classic study that was done in conjunction with the eclipse in 1919 that provided the first validation for relativity, but there has been much more done since then. And the way science works, you don't want to put your trust in any one study. You want a collection of studies that all point in the same direction. So I would, and in fact, I would say the best evidence for the afterlife is not even a single type of experience like an NDE, like Kevin and I were just talking about. That's why I wanted us today, to the extent we can, to talk about deathbed visions that are before death, NDEs that occur during or close to clinical death, and then after-death communications, because all 3 have elements in common that tend to be mutually supporting and reinforcing. And there's not a single article or book that I would point people to the exclusion of others. Not everybody has time to read the entire field of literature, but I think the strength of the literature in afterlife related research works the same way as the literature in physics or chemistry. It's the whole of the field where the real strength is. Having said that, are there introductions to different particular subjects like deathbed visions or NDEs or after-death communications that I can recommend as good introduction points? Yes, but there's not like a single study that on its own is the linchpin. The real, as in science in general, the real strength of the case is based in the multitude of different studies pointing in the same direction.
All right, we have another super chat from Pop. Looks like short for popcorn. Thank you, Jimmy and Cam, for all the amazing content. I'll become a YouTube member, as that's my familiar place. Yeah, thanks. You guys can do that as well if you'd like. We have YouTube memberships, which you can sign up at any amount. I think it's from $5 to, last time I checked, maybe $25. You guys can support the ministry that way. I would definitely suggest, though, if you are going to support, use either Patreon or Donor Box, because YouTube actually takes, you may not know this, YouTube actually takes, when you send in a super chat or you sign up for a membership on YouTube, they actually take 30%, which is a ton. Patreon, I think, takes 5%. Donor Box takes even less. So I would definitely recommend, if you want to help out the ministry the best way possible, use one of those two methods, which again, we've got linked in the description of this video if you want to support us through Patreon or through Donor Box. So with that, let's go ahead and turn to another caller. How does that sound, Jimmy?
Sure.
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and ask Clark now to unmute. He's going to be joining us. This is the first time he's been on with Christianity.
Hey guys,
Clark, it sounds like I can actually hear you. We've got some echo going on. Do you have any headphones you can use?
Yeah, if you give me a sec, let me try to find some.
Actually, I think it kind of calmed down, so I don't hear any echo anymore. So let's just give it a shot and just see what happens.
Okay. Well, I just want to make a quick comment first and then ask my question. The comment is, I work in the hospital and deal with a lot of patients that have had heart attacks. And I can recall one patient that told me he's died twice, and it was in the ICU. I think they were, running a code on him, chest compressions, and he said he was hovering above his body, and he saw on one of the medication pumps like a serial number, and he was able to memorize that, and then asked the nurse when, he was resuscitated if those numbers were actually on there, and they were. So I just thought that was really interesting.
And before your question, there are similar cases in the literature where people have memorized serial numbers from things they saw in the hospital and then reported it back. There are some cases like that in the Self Does Not Die book.
Okay. Yeah, I thought it was very interesting. He told me it was very peaceful. He went and saw, family members, friends, and that he's not afraid to die after that experience. Mm-hmm. But my question is, there's a book I read many years ago, and I'm sure you've heard of it. It's called Proof of Heaven by neurosurgeon Eban Alexander. Mm-hmm. And, he has this very vivid account of the afterlife, and it's very believable. And to me, certain aspects seem to, match the Bible, the Christian story. Mm-hmm. For example, he said he went in the presence of the Supreme Creator, and that God is love, and he felt connected to the entire universe. And but the thing that's always bothered me is he doesn't ever mention an encounter with Jesus. And, Jesus says no one goes to the Father except through him. And so I don't know what to make of that. On the one hand, his story sounds so believable, and, this message of love, and, that's our ultimate purpose. I guess, I see that as consistent with the Christian faith, but then to be in the presence of that Supreme Creator without having first gone through Christ or talking to Christ, I just don't know what to make of that.
Okay, well, let me address that issue first, and then I'll give you my overall impression of Eban Alexander, because I've read his book. I think people, if they stay in the afterlife long enough, will end up, as a Christian, I would say, I think they will meet Jesus. But that doesn't happen instantaneously. Even Jesus himself, in his parable of Lazarus and the rich man, describes a progression of events in the afterlife where you're not immediately at your final destination. He says, for example, Lazarus died and then was carried by the angels to the bosom of Abraham. So that implies there's a kind of transitional period between the moment of death and when you arrive at your final destination in the afterlife. Now, I think ultimately, if you stay in the afterlife long enough, you will end up meeting Jesus. And there are many accounts of that exact thing happening. In fact, there's a whole book I've got that looks at this from a Christian perspective, where they went looking for, okay, do people see Jesus in the afterlife, or do they also see Buddha, or do they also see Muhammad, or, do you see whoever you believe? And what this author found in the research he did was that you have an overwhelming number of Jesus reports, and only outlier reports of anybody else. Even people who were not Christian would end up seeing Jesus. So I think that if you stay long enough, that's going to happen. And if Eban Alexander had stayed long enough, I would assume it would happen with him too. But number one, he may not have stayed long enough. Number two, he may not remember it, because you're trying to, when they restart your heart, that's not a guarantee you're going to remember everything you experienced. And so, in fact, a lot of people don't even remember having an NDE. And so there may be a data retention problem of trying to retain data about what you experienced in the afterlife and then translating it back into human processable memories. And there could be memory loss as a result. So he may have met Jesus and just not remembered it. The third problem, though, and this is where I kind of transition into telling you my opinion about Eban Alexander. Now, I already mentioned with Kevin that that anytime anybody writes a book about their experience, I'm suspicious. I'm more suspicious when their case is an outlier. And one of the things about Eban Alexander's experience, by the way, for people who may not know him, he was a neurosurgeon who got encephalitis in the brain and spent 11 days in a coma or something like that, and then came back with this experience report. So, and those facts, like he was in a coma for 7 days, for however many days it was with encephalitis, that's all verified. But
I did want to mention, Jimmy, right before you come back on that, is that I've actually had him on the channel. So he was on with actually Gary Habermas, who Gary Habermas is super big on NDEs as well. So they had a conversation on Capturing Christianity. If you guys are interested, go search for Eban Alexander and Gary Habermas on Capturing Christianity. You'll be able to find it and watch that. They actually were slated to come on and discuss reincarnation, because that's one of the things that Eban has been drawn to now as a result of his experience. He's now convinced that reincarnation is real. So that's what they were going to talk about. We just never got it planned out. But just wanted to mention that really quickly.
Okay. So Eban Alexander's experience is an extreme outlier. There are many dissimilarities. Now, he has some common elements, like meeting God. That's pretty common. Feeling love. That's very common. But there are other aspects of his experience that just do not fit the standard profile remotely. Like, he reports that in his experience, he did not have any knowledge of his earthly life. It's like he forgot his earthly identity. And I'm not aware of other people reporting that. That's a very different experience if it's a real experience. And he may have perceived all this in his coma, but it doesn't fit the standard model. And so that gives me reason to question this experience. And there are other reasons too, but to just give it a bottom line, I would put Eban Alexander's experience in what I'd call my gray basket. Unlike, it's not in my black basket like Kevin Malarkey and Betty Eady and Daniel Brinkley. It's also not in my white basket. I'd put it somewhere in the middle. I don't know what to make of it fully. I don't have the evidence to accuse him of hoaxing. He may have genuinely perceived all of this, but what I can say is his experience is atypical. And so I think in order to do significant research, we need to look at what do most people report, not to what do the outlier experiences look like.
Okay. And do you think it would be a problem for the Christian faith if, say, his experience was genuine, it really happened, but he went in the presence of the Father before, coming and seeing Christ?
I think that that the afterlife is so complex that it exceeds our present ability to understand. And so if he came back with that as what he remembered of his experience, I wouldn't have a problem with that. I'd have a much bigger problem with his endorsement of reincarnation, but that appears to be something that is not rooted in his experience itself.
Okay. If you have time, I did have one other question.
Real quick.
Yeah, feel free.
I don't know if you've heard of Brian Melvin. There's like a YouTube video on his testimony with maybe 3 million views.
Mm-hmm.
But I think he was an atheist guy, and he said he went to hell and saw Hitler.
Mm-hmm.
But this experience he initially had, he said it like looked like heaven, and the people there thought it was heaven. What he described, it seemed very similar to me to Purgatory.
Mm-hmm.
And then he quickly realized it wasn't heaven, and even though these people thought that they were in, I guess the heavenly afterlife, it actually,
Like the good
um,
place.
yeah, yeah, it,
Mm-hmm.
it was the opposite. And there were layers to it, and he descended deeper and deeper, and then was in the presence of like demonic forces.
Mm-hmm.
But after the experience, he said he became Christian. I think he's Baptist or some, Protestant denomination, and he goes and tries to evangelize like Native Americans.
Mm-hmm.
But he seemed like, a genuine person. It, seemed a credible testimony. My question is, as a Catholic, we take the Eucharist as literal, sacramental body, blood of our Lord. And Jesus says, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man, you have no life in you. Was he speaking in hyperbole, saying that? I know God's not bound by his sacraments, but I guess what's the Catholic position on like people that don't receive the Eucharist, but God still can admit them into the
Yeah.
afterlife, or
So this
understand that?
is specific to a Catholic point of view. So I can answer the question, but we're getting a little bit removed from the scientific research into an afterlife. But from a Catholic point of view, God only holds people accountable for what they know. He doesn't hold people accountable for what they don't know. And so if someone doesn't know that they need to receive the Eucharist, then God's not going to hold them accountable for that. You only get held accountable for what you know. And so if someone is innocently ignorant of any number of truths, but they otherwise cooperate with the grace and the light that they have, then God will make a place for them in heaven. This is just the same issue as, can someone be saved without consciously knowing about Jesus? Well, Jesus is the way that God wants us to approach him to be saved. But if someone is innocently unaware of the fact they need to do that, then many Christians, including Catholics, would say, well, God will have an allowance for that. He's not going to hold people accountable for things they innocently didn't realize. And the same thing is true about receiving the Eucharist or any other point of Christian doctrine that you might want to mention. By the way, in regard to this gentleman that you mentioned, I have not seen his video, so I can't really form a conclusion about his experience. But if I would note that about 20% of NDEs include negative elements, and some of them are described as hellish. So the idea that everybody just has this blissed out, everything's so wonderful in the afterlife experience, that is not true of everybody. That seems to be true of about 80% of people, but it is not true of the other 20%.
Howard Storm, I think, is one of the main people. Maybe that's the wrong term to use, but he's a very prominent case. His case of near-death experiences is really interesting. It was actually featured in the movie that actually just came out on near-death experiences, After Death, who I interviewed the director of that movie. It's on Capturing Christianity. I also interviewed one of the cardiologists that was featured in that film as well. So if you guys are interested, go check those out. But Clark, thank you so much for joining us. All right, now we're going to turn to some more super chats.
We should mention the purpose, because we need to bring it up periodically as new people join us. We should mention that while we're trying to present you with this great new content, including all the not phone calls, but the Zoom calls for the first time from live callers, there is this special reason why we're here. We do need to raise about $4,000 in monthly donations in order to get out of the deficit we're in. So just a reminder, you can find the donation link in the description. We've made it to where you can support us through Patreon, which a lot of people use and are comfortable with. But if you're not a Patreon fan, we also have Donor Box for you. So one way or another, those are good ways to support us. And they're also better than channel subscriptions because, as Cameron mentioned, YouTube takes a 30% cut of those. So they don't help in the same way that these others would. But if you see the value in what we're doing and you want to see that value continue to be made, then that is absolutely something we would welcome, is if you're able to become one of our regular monthly supporters.
I will also mention really quickly that we have some things, some special things we're only giving this one time, basically during this week of fundraising that we're going to be giving out to folks that join and support us. So we're giving away a PDF on gospel reliability that's already available if you sign up on Patreon at any giving amount, even if it's $1, you get access to this PDF on gospel reliability. Super great little article, highly recommend it. Then at the $25 tier, which is kind of the tier that we're targeting for this fundraiser, which Jimmy, we mentioned earlier, we really only need 160 of you guys to sign up at that $25 amount to get us out of the situation that we're currently in, which is completely doable. I think we're going to be able to achieve that hopefully this week. So we've got the best argument for God that we're giving out to anyone that signs up at the $25 tier. It was authored by Pat Flynn, who I will have on the channel fairly soon to talk about this book, but we're giving this away to anyone that signs up at the tier 3, and that's in addition to everything that you already get at Patreon. And then in addition to that, if you sign up at the $50 amount, we're giving away this brand new statue of Jesus that's been created and designed based on the Shroud of Turin. So there's like literal wounds that you can see on the side of Jesus here, in his feet, in his hands, and this is even more accurate than the standard model that was created, or the sculpture that was created by Luigi. I can't remember his last name. Matteo, his sculpture is just a little bit less accurate according to the artist that's worked on this. So, and this also is not available anywhere. One thing we didn't mention earlier is that this was actually the price of this, if you were to buy this directly, is $350. So if you sign up on Patreon, we've talked with the guy who's created these. His name is Matthew Collins, and we've worked out a deal where we can actually give these to you guys in return for your support of Capturing Christianity. So if you sign up at the $50 amount, you get the PDF, the book, and the 12-inch sculpture of Jesus. So, and thank you guys so much for your support. Should we turn to some super chats really quickly before we turn? And we can go ahead and switch, I think, also at this point to the second subtopic, which we've already been talking about this entire time, but we'll give you a little chance to kind of flesh out a little bit more for us. But let's go to some super chats that were sent in. This is another way that you guys can support us, and I really appreciate it if you guys do choose to do this. So Katarina says, what about people seeing Hindu gods or talking to Allah in NDEs? There was an NDE where a woman wanted to stay in the love and light, but Jesus forced her to go back to earth.
Yeah, so I'm going to pull up real quick the name of a particular book I want to recommend. I mentioned it earlier. Let's see. I may or may not be able to get it quickly enough, but okay, the book is called Is Christianity Compatible with Deathbed and Near-Death Experiences? It's by J. Stephen Miller, and it's the most thorough resource I know on this topic. Miller is the researcher I mentioned earlier who specifically looked into what do people see in terms of religious figures, and he found the overwhelming majority of reports of religious figures were either God or an angel of God or Jesus, and things reporting non-Christian gods were a distinct minority. They were outliers, even in countries where even in countries where Christianity is not the norm. So, for example, in your question, you say, well, what about Allah? Well, Allah is just the Arabic word for God. That's all it means. Allah is not a different God. Allah is God. That is how Arabic-speaking Christians talk about God. So, you know, if an Arabic speaker says, I talk to Allah, I'd say, oh, well, tell me what he had to say. When it comes to interaction with other elements of religious content, it's true that what people see in the afterlife, at least in their beginning experience of it, because as I mentioned, there's a transition period that even Jesus talks about. It is, you don't immediately get a download of everything in the universe to know. And so people are going to naturally read their early moments in the afterlife in terms of what they're already familiar with. So, for example, sometimes people report in NDEs and in deathbed visions, to go back to those for a minute, they report angels coming and taking them to the afterlife, or, I'm here to take you to the afterlife. Even if they're on their deathbed, they're not dead yet. Here in the West, we refer to these as angels, which is a term that means messenger in Greek, and it's basically a job description. They come with a message for human beings from God, from a Jewish and Christian and Muslim perspective. In India, where research has been done on deathbed visions, the personification of death is known as Yama. And so they refer, when they'll say, oh, I've got this non-human spirit here who's saying he's come to take me into the afterlife, they call them Yamduts, meaning messengers of death. And so it looks like we've got the same basic experience happening. They're seeing a non-human spirit, someone they don't know, who says, hi, I'm here to take you to the afterlife. In the West, we call them angels. In India, where they personify death as Yama, they call them Yamduts. But it's the same basic phenomenon. It's a spirit. It's not of a loved one. They also, in India, report loved ones coming to welcome you into the afterlife. And we report that in the West, but it looks like in the same country, in these very different countries, we have the same basic phenomena happening. You have in a deathbed vision or in an NDE, you get welcomed by a loved one or a set of loved ones, or you get welcomed by a non-human spirit that you don't know. We're just applying different names to these in the different cultures, but they seem to be the same underlying experience. But if you'd like to read more about the compatibility of deathbed visions and NDEs with Christianity, or at least one Christian perspective on this, check out J. Steve Miller's book, Is Christianity Compatible with Deathbed and Near-Death Experiences?
All right, we've got a super chat from Joe Quinn. How do I say this, Jimmy? Joe Quinn.
Joaquin.
You said that so matter of fact. You're like, Joaquin. I should have known that too. I mean, Joaquin Phoenix. Come on now. Okay. All right. So this one says, and thank you for your super chat. Hey, Jimmy, what's your opinion of the University of Virginia's DOPS? Do you think it's a legit research institution? A little bit off topic.
Well, it does do it. So I forget the exact. It's like the Department of Perceptual Studies. It's basically a parapsychology lab, or what a parapsychology lab developed into. And at the University of Virginia, they have had legitimate parapsychological research happening, most famously for the NDE and cases of the reincarnation type, or court research that was done by Evan Stevenson and now by his successor, Jim Tucker. So they're a legitimate research institution. Yeah. They have produced quality scholarly work.
Okay, fair enough. Why don't we do this? So I mentioned at the very beginning of the stream, so we're talking about the afterlife. That's the sort of overall topic, and we're splitting it into three subcategories. First one is deathbed visions. We talked about that a little bit. Second one is near-death experiences, and the third one is after-death communications. Let's now, Jimmy, I'll turn it back over to you to kind of discuss a little bit near-death experiences, the research surrounding that. What typically happens in these near-death experiences, that sort of thing.
Okay. So as I mentioned earlier, I think that the strongest case for the afterlife is not in any one of these three phenomena. They actually support each other because they blend into each other and you get the same elements. So like I mentioned, a lot of people in their deathbed visions, they learn things they didn't previously know before that turn out to be true and they couldn't have guessed. They see light, they hear music, they're greeted by loved ones who are there to welcome them into the afterlife. Well, all that stuff happens in near-death experiences too. It's like it's just further along. When you have the experience, you have either clinically died or almost clinically died, and you have basically a lot of the same sets of experiences. Now, in terms of history, there has been a shift. Near-death experiences, or NDEs, have been reported all through history. We do have historical records of them. But what would happen is in the past, we didn't have medical technology or know the techniques needed to revive someone once their heart had stopped. Sometimes the heart will restart spontaneously. And so for historical cases, deathbed, near-death experiences are not nearly as common as they are now, because it would require someone's heart to restart. But that did sometimes happen. And then they would report, yeah, I was in the afterlife and this happened and this happened, and I'm going to lead a better life now because of how much love I saw in the afterlife, for example. I know of a medieval case where a guy had a near-death experience, and he came back, he settled his affairs with his family, and he went to join a monastery because he wanted to devote his life to God after that experience. Now, in the 1950s and especially the 1960s, new medical techniques and technology came online that allowed us for the first time to have a real hope of reviving someone who had experienced cardiac arrest. And this led to an explosion of new reports of near-death experiences because we'd been able to bring so many people back that we'd never been able to bring back before. And they reported a lot of phenomena that, and as I mentioned, this first came really to public attention in the mid-1970s with Raymond Moody's book, Life After Life. They reported a lot of the same things from deathbed visions. They also reported some new things, like they would report autoscopy, or seeing, I mentioned that earlier, where you see yourself from an outside perspective, typically from an above perspective, where you can see the doctors and nurses working on you. They would report sometimes going through a tunnel, or if not a tunnel, at least a transition or movement of some kind. I've been told, although by a researcher, although I haven't verified this for myself, that in Japan, for example, they don't visualize it as a tunnel. They visualize it as crossing a bridge into a beautiful garden. And then people would also report seeing a beautiful garden or a beautiful city or something like a park where people were very happy, at least in most of them. In 20% of them, there were negative elements. Sometimes they would describe them as even hellish. Like one person got brought back. It was a woman, and she just all she would say is, "I saw Dante's Inferno." In any event, there's been a lot of research done on these in recent years. Multiple researchers have looked into this. There are a lot of good books. I don't recommend the solo books. The ones I recommend are the ones that are case study collections, where you're not just looking at one experience that could be an outlier. Maybe someone misremembered something or misperceived something or is even lying. But if you aggregate a lot of cases together, then you get a much better understanding of what tends to happen in these experiences. And as I mentioned, they contain veridical information, a bunch of them. In particular, because it's the best book on this out there right now, I recommend the book by Titus Rivas and others, The Self Does Not Die, which shows over 100 cases of that have veridical information with independent validation. And I've already given one example of that, but one that I'd like to mention is a kind of experience that also is a commonality with deathbed visions. This happens both in deathbed visions and in near-death experiences. It's what's known in parapsychology as a peak in Darien experience. Peak is P-E-A-K, like the peak of a mountain, and Darien is a province in Panama. The phrase peak in Darien comes from an old poem, and I won't go into all that history, but what it refers to in modern parapsychological literature is either a deathbed vision or a near-death experience where you not only are greeted by departed loved ones, but you see someone in the afterlife who you didn't know was dead. And then it turns out to be true. One of the first reports of this was reported by the British writer Frances Cobb in an essay called Peak in Darien, which is where this experience got its name from. And she recounts an incident where you have a woman who's dying. I think it may have been of tuberculosis or consumption, as they called it at the time. But she's dying in England. She's got a big family of, lots of brothers and sisters. And as she's dying, she has a deathbed vision where she sees 3 of her siblings who everybody already knew were dead. It's like, oh, here's this sibling and this sibling and this sibling. But then she sees a fourth sibling who is her brother that everyone believes is alive and well in India. And the fact she just saw this fourth sibling who everyone thinks is just fine and living in India, because of the British Empire at the time, it was so distressing to hear that he was in the afterlife that one of the women in the room just couldn't handle it and had to leave and just fled the room. But then it turned out what this dying woman saw was accurate. And they got letters informing them, regretfully, your fourth sibling has died in India. And he died before the dying woman had seen him in her deathbed vision. So he was, if he survived, if survival is real, he was in the afterlife at the time of the deathbed vision. And there are other examples of that. One that's particularly strong. Now, in this case, they had no way of knowing that that the brother was dead. Another case where something much like that happens was reported by Sir William Barrett, who wrote the first major book on deathbed visions. And his wife was a surgeon, a doctor, a medical doctor, who worked at a women's hospital. And so she was attending a woman who had a heart condition. She was experiencing heart failure, and she was pregnant. And so this was a very difficult pregnancy. And she gave birth to the child. But it was such a strain on her system that she was starting to die, which, maternal postpartum death was very common. This is around 1923, 24. It used to be much more common than it is now. Well, she sees her father, and she's narrating her deathbed vision. She sees her father come to welcome her into the afterlife, and she says, "Oh, there's Vida." And Vida was her sister. So she didn't know Vida was dead. Turns out Vida was dead. Vida had died like 3 weeks earlier. But because she's got a heart condition, because she's in the hospital and pregnant with a difficult pregnancy that is in the end going to kill her, the matron of the hospital said, do not tell her about Vida's death. It would be too much of a strain on her system. Just keep that from her for now. And so the family knew about Vida's death, but did not tell the woman. They even went to the extent, at the matron's suggestion, of her husband pre-screened all of her mail. So anyone who wrote to her, which they did back in the day before we had texting, anything anyone wrote to her, her husband read first to make sure it did not contain any information about Vida dying. And so they rigorously screened her to keep this information away from her. And yet, as she's having her deathbed vision, she sees her sister Vida in the afterlife. And this is what's known as a Purgatory experience. Well, the same thing happens in NDEs, where you actually venture a little bit into the afterlife, and you may see your loved ones coming to greet you, and you may see someone you weren't expecting to see. So this is another commonality between these experiences that points in the same direction. And it's an example of veridical information. The person, had no natural way of knowing it. It's not something you could have guessed, and it turned out to be true. So that would be one data point favoring this being an objectively real experience rather than a dying brain hallucination or something like that. So I guess that's the basics of what I wanted to cover with those two experiences, and I'd be happy to take more questions.
Okay, yeah, let's do that now. I've already got someone queued up. His name is Tom, and Tom
Howdy,
is
Tom.
here. Tom, go ahead and ask your question.
So you can hear me fine?
Yes,
Or-
yeah, we can hear you great.
Right. So how do you reckon this view that you're proposing of the afterlife seems to me more like the Platonic view or Plutarch's view, as N.T. Wright says. Isn't the Jewish and also Christian view that first you die and then you go to Sheol, to the grave, and then eventually during the end times everyone is resurrected and judged? Isn't that what Ecclesiastes teaches? For example, in 9:5 it says that I know nothing right now. So how does that work?
Yeah. Well, so let's deal with Ecclesiastes first. Ecclesiastes is written from an earthly perspective. You'll notice one of the recurring themes in Ecclesiastes and one of the recurring frames in phrases in Ecclesiastes is under the sun. So the author of Ecclesiastes is assuming a perspective about here on earth and what do we know, and we don't see the dead rising up, and praising God. So he assumes they don't, but that's based on his perspective. They didn't have near-death experience literature back in his day. So he's just going based on what he knows. In terms of there's no implication here of what ends up happening in this literature regarding the Christian view. There's no conflict because all of these experiences we're talking about today are occurring in the here and now. And all of the deathbed experience, all of the near-death experiences that we have access to are from people who were dead only a short time. So none of them died and stayed dead until the resurrection. They died, they stayed in the afterlife, it seems, for a brief interval, and then they came back when the doctors were able to restart their hearts. So, so that doesn't really tell us anything about what's going to happen in the future. The Christian view would be, well, they stay in the afterlife for a while, and the Christian and Jewish and Muslim view would be they're going to stay in the afterlife for a while, and they'll have a disembodied experience for that time. It's known as the intermediate state. But then eventually God's going to raise them from the dead. On the other hand, on a Hindu view or a Buddhist view, well, they die and they stay in the afterlife for a period of time in a disembodied intermediate state, and then they're going to be reincarnated. So these experiences, because none of them go for that long, they just don't address the question of what happens, if anything, after the intermediate state. The research data is also consistent with the more Platonic idea of you die and then you stay a ghost forever. Also, these types of experiences don't really tell us about what happens further down the line, and so they're compatible actually with multiple religious views.
Okay, and what would you say of the argument that in order to go to heaven, you needed something special needed to happen? For example, Elijah gets raised to heaven, I think, and I think Catholics believe the same thing happened to Mary. There were other ways. I think that Ignatius, in his letters, he seems to think that martyrs go straight to heaven and that other people need to wait until the end times. As I recall,
Okay.
I was listening to
So
Del Martin's
yeah, so
view.
a common belief in Christianity is that Enoch and Elijah, two Old Testament figures, were assumed bodily into heaven without dying. In the Catholic and Orthodox view, Mary also had that happen to her. Either she did die or she didn't, but one way or another, she was assumed bodily into heaven. The standard belief, like with Irenaeus of Lyon, it's a pious belief. It's not actually church teaching, but it's piously believed that martyrs who have been killed go straight to heaven without a need for further purification. That's not actually church teaching, but it's a pious speculation. And they don't have their bodies with them because they were killed. That's what caused them to head into the afterlife to begin with. So they will get their bodies back at the resurrection on the standard Christian view.
Right, but the issue was that so why did Elijah have to be and Mary and so on have? I mean, how can they be godly assumed into the spiritual heaven if it's not physical, right? If the physical heaven will only happen in the end times here on earth, how can those two views seem to be at odds, right?
So what Christians have understood is that heaven is at least capable of receiving bodies in some form. That doesn't mean they're spread out over space the way they are down here on earth, but they're capable of receiving bodies in some form because Jesus has his body with him up in heaven. And so all Christians who believe in the bodily resurrection and ascension of Jesus are going to acknowledge that in some way heaven is capable of containing bodies. We don't know what that way is God hasn't chosen to reveal it to us, and we don't have scientific instruments capable of measuring the spiritual heaven, but it at least has the capability to receive bodies, which in exceptional circumstances it has. Now, the way the book of Revelation depicts our final state is down here on a renovated earth. Well, we know earth has physical bodies because we've got them down here with us right now. So there's no problem with the final state incorporating bodies. And before we get to the final state, heaven is at least capable of receiving bodies, but they may not be spatially extended the way they are down here on earth. At least that's what I think we can say with confidence. You could speculate about more possibilities than that, but I think heaven is capable of receiving bodies in some form is about all we can say with confidence, and we have to leave the rest in God's hands.
Right. So I was thinking of the Purgatory
Real quick,
teaching.
Tom, I'll let you have one more come back on this, and then we'll turn to other callers.
Okay, thank you. So if the martyrs get, rewarded and they go straight to heaven and other people have to be purified, shouldn't these other near-death experiences have a lot of purification? Or it seems
They
like
do.
most people just go straight to heaven, right?
Oh, number one, they're only experiencing, like I mentioned, they only experience a little bit of the afterlife. So they may experience a great, rush of wonderfulness when they get there, and they may only be able to remember the wonderfulness. They may not remember, oh, and I was also being purified. But in fact, there are a lot of case reports of people being purified. And this is, I'll just dip ahead to after-death communications, for example. But there is a case in the literature where a gentleman, I believe he was in New York, was coming out of his house onto the street, and at the bottom of his steps, he saw a woman with her back turned to him, and she seemed to be she seemed to be a physical woman, but she turned around, and it was his grandmother who was deceased. So he's seeing a visual apparition of a grandmother that is so realistic. It's not transparent it's not glowing. It looks like a real person. And he says, "What are you doing here?" And she says, "I'm so sorry." And then she apologizes to him for all the things she did wrong in her life and says, "Please forgive me." And there are numerous examples like that where there are examples of people's fathers showing back up and saying, "I'm so sorry for what I did to you, my child. I was wrapped up in criminal activity earlier in my life, and I'm very sorry for what I did." There's a famous deathbed vision. So this is, again, the interconnection between the three phenomena. There's a deathbed vision where a little girl is dying of, what do they call it? It's a kind of fever that results in excess bilirubin in the blood. And it causes you to become jaundiced. But she's dying of that, and she's having a vision of the afterlife. She's seeing, and this goes on for a few days in her case, and she's able to report about a neighbor lady who comes to visit her and says, "Oh, your son is here," and her son was dead. And so she is able to report on what the son is doing, and he's doing okay in the afterlife. He likes being there. That comforts the mother. But then another neighbor lady comes after the mother's gone and says, "Hey, wait a minute. Don't you remember how bad he was? I mean, we know he would always take your playthings and break them, and we wouldn't let. He would cuss, and he was a little hellion. We wouldn't let him near our children or you. How can you say he's in heaven?" And the little girl who's dying says, "Well, he says he is in heaven. He's learning to be good now." And that would reflect a Catholic understanding or an Orthodox understanding or a Jewish understanding of purifying us from our remaining, temptations and disordered desires. So that sounds like, even though this little girl was Protestant, didn't have the language of purgatory, she's saying, yeah, he's in heaven. He's learning how to be good, which is, she's like 10 years old. So this is not theologically sophisticated, but that sounds right. She also says God is, and I'll probably use more advanced words than she did, but she said, look at the environment he grew up in. basically. He had all this cussing and stuff around him. He didn't know any better, and God takes that into account.
Okay, Tom,
Right.
I know you probably have more follow-ups, but we do need to turn to other callers. So I really do appreciate you joining us today. And let's go ahead and take a super chat that was just sent in from Adam. This one is a very significant super chat. I think it's the most that you can actually send in. It's $100.
Wow.
So thank you so
Thank
much,
you.
Adam. He says, thank you both for your generous sharing of knowledge and positive discussion. Are there any specific angelic or demonic anecdotes that can be pulled from current NDE research or other evidence of the afterlife?
The answer is yes. There are reports of both angels and demons in this kind of research, specifically in NDEs. Now, angels show up in deathbed visions, and they show up in near-death experiences, and even sometimes they show up in after-death communications. There was one woman, for example, who was grieving the loss of her 2 sons. And according to her experience, an angel appeared to her and took her to see her sons in the afterlife so that she could see they were okay. You also, as I mentioned, you get angels who sometimes greet you into the afterlife, either in a deathbed vision or a near-death experience. And there's an interesting cultural difference here. There were a pair of researchers who wrote a book called At the Hour of Death that was a major study of deathbed visions in the United States and in India. They wanted to pick 2 different, wildly different cultures to see what kind of reports were made in both. And one of the things they found was that statistically, in the United States, people saw more relatives, more lost loved ones than they did angels. By the way, also another point that's different than hallucinations, when people are having these deathbed visions and near-death experiences, they don't hallucinate people who are not dead. You know, they don't like see their living sister or their living boss or their living son in the afterlife. They only see people who actually are in the afterlife, which is another sign this isn't just hallucination. But in America, we see a lot more relatives, a lot more loved ones welcoming us into the afterlife, and not as many angels, though they are there. In India, it's the reverse. In India, they see a lot more angels, or yamduts, and only sometimes see relatives. And the researchers speculated this might be because of the standoffishness of Indian parents compared to American parents and so forth, who are more demonstrative of affection. But that's an interesting cultural difference that's out there in the data. In terms of demons, where those tend to show up is in negative near-death experiences. They don't so much show up in deathbed visions, although something like them does with some yamduts in India, because in India the belief is if you've lived a bad life, the yamdut who comes to get you is going to be frightening. And so some people will report a frightening yamdut. Of course, here in the West, we have frightening angels too. You know, do not be afraid is one of the things angels in the Bible are known for saying, because they can be scary too. Just because it's scary doesn't mean it's a demon. But in the actual negative NDEs, you do have reports of demons tormenting people, or at least menacing them. There's a famous one by a woman named, I believe it's Nancy Evans Bush, who she was giving birth and she was having a difficult birth, and she had a near-death experience during the birth. And she seemed to fly out into darkness, which she perceived as if it were kind of like outer space. And she sensed an immense separation between her and God. And then she saw these 6 circles that approached her, and she didn't know what they were. And this happened like in the 50s or something. She later saw something that looked like them. They looked like yin yang symbols. And they would flicker between having the black on one side and the white on the other. They would flicker back and forth, and they communicated to her by doing this flickering. This is what she perceived. She perceived that these 6 circles were telling her, you never existed. all of your life was a dream. It was all a game. It was all a joke. Your husband does not exist. Your baby does not exist. None of it is real. It is all, you don't exist. It is all a joke. And they tormented her in this way. And then she ended up back in her body. The doctors were able to restart her heart. And this was at a time when near-death experiences were not yet being researched, much less negative ones. And she had to live with this for a long time. But I'll tell you what it sounds like to me. It sounds like an aerial toll gate, as described in Eastern Orthodoxy, where the soul is taken on a journey to heaven and at certain points is challenged by demons who try to torment it, particularly with knowledge of previous sins. But then the soul eventually, with angelic guidance, makes its way to God. And it sounds to me like this is kind of like an aerial toll gate, which is sort of the Eastern Orthodox equivalent of purgatory. So there's some commonalities in the literature there, but we do have multiple people who report things like angels and demons really across all three types of experiences, but the demons tend to show up in the near-death experiences in particular.
Let's take one more super chat before we turn to more callers. This one's from Anthony, and I'll kind of, if I can, Jimmy, I'll try to limit your answer fairly short because we're going to address this more directly on Friday, the call-in show on Friday, discussing demons and aliens and all of that. So he says, "Hey Jimmy, a gentleman on Pints with Aquinas just said he believed demons infest and control AI language models. What do you make of this?"
Well, okay, so in order for that to happen, demons would need to be using psychokinetic abilities. Psychokinesis is mind over matter. In popular culture, it's often called telekinesis, but in parapsychology, it's called psychokinesis. And, well, demons have minds, but they don't have physical hands or anything to manipulate an AI with. So they would need to be using PK or psychokinesis to manipulate it. And since AI language models work on the level of electrons running through wires, that's micro PK. That's psychokinesis on the very small scale. And there's been a lot of research done on micro PK in humans. Well, we have some evidence from the Bible that would indicate that angels are capable of affecting physical matter, including on the micro scale. For example, when God sends a plague because of what David has done, the angel is distributing the plague and germs are microscopic. So we have evidence for angelic micro PK, and that would be an ability demons have too. So I think it's possible for demons to control an AI language model, to hack it, in other words. My question would be, what evidence do you have that that's the case? How do you know it's not just an AI being a jerk or being a random weirdo? So
or being programmed to talk that way that it is.
Yeah. If you had something paranormal happening in conjunction with it, like you ask the AI, levitate that book over on my shelf, and then the book levitates, well, that would be evidence for something paranormal. And if it's an AI that's averse to the holy and malicious that can levitate your books, I would say, okay, you got a good case for a demon, either that or a nasty dybbuk. But I think there's a lot of reckless speculation about demons being behind things without any evidence.
Okay, let's turn to another caller now. We've got, I believe it's Mihoville. Correct me if I'm wrong in the correct way to pronounce your name. Is that the way to say it?
Yes, Mihoville.
Mihoville.
Nice to meet you, Mihoville.
Nice to meet you. So, I had comment and then I want to hear what you think, Jimmy. So one thing is that we are talking about in all these topics is basically everything is around death. Mm-hmm. And I have been doing research. Yeah, so I have been doing research in neuroscience basically for more than a decade now. So, and one thing I noticed that the more I studied, that we less understand what death even is. Mm-hmm. For example, when somebody is dying quickly, the person dies, but if we get brain from that person or animal, doesn't matter in this case, basically all hardware that we have there is still mostly intact. And for every I mean, just looking at that, everything, cells and structure, everything should be working as person was alive. We can even, for example, if we take animal model, we can take brain in, we can inject viruses. Viruses can only infect live cells. And we can get almost 90, 95, sometimes 100% of cells get infected. But then at the same time, you have somebody who died, who was dying from some long disease, some disease where they were dying slowly. We get we got several brains from patients right after they died from autopsies. There was no brain. Basically, there was no brain left. But they were talking a few hours ago with doctors and nurses. So that's one thing that makes everything really. I mean, it just gets, all these lines become really blurry. When is really that moment of death? Yeah. So I just wanted to hear what you think. And
okay. So I think that the phenomenon we describe as death is actually a process that has different stages in the process and that may take different elements at different times. As you mentioned, sometimes the brain seems remarkably intact after death has occurred, and indeed there's evidence of that. It used to be thought, and I'm sure you're probably aware of this as someone researching this area, it used to be thought that brain damage happens within 5 minutes or 15 minutes of cardiac arrest. And we now have good evidence that that is not normally the case, that we can revive people if they were cooled down. We can revive people 6 hours after death. And it now looks like actually the brain damage that was sometimes caused was not caused by the brain being starved of oxygen for so long. It was frequently caused by the attempts to revive the person in what's known as a reperfusion injury, where if we introduced blood flow in the wrong way, it was the reintroduced blood flow that caused the damage to the brain. So it looks like we have functional brains for much longer than was previously believed. So I think death is a complex process. What the ultimate definition of death would be is some kind of irreversibility of biological process applying to the entire body. And if you have an irreversible cessation of biological processes for the entire body, that is clearly death. On the other hand, there are a lot of things that are technologically conditioned that were once regarded as markers of irreversible cessation, like cessation of heartbeat. Prior to, the mid-20th century, we didn't have the ability to restart people's hearts, but we've got that now. And so the cardiac arrest criterion, it may be a good criterion for clinical death, but it does not automatically mean total irreversible cessation of life. So I think this is an area that has complexity to it that we now appreciate better due to improving medical techniques and research. But I think we're not yet at a point of having a good a good detailed definition of death beyond just irreversible cessation of biological function of the entire organism.
Yeah. How would that then, in your opinion, influence near-death experiences? And
well, that's why they're called near death, because of the difficulty of establishing what are we going to call death? If someone's heart stops, traditionally that's death. But then if we restart it, well, now they're alive again. So that raises a question of, were they really dead? I mean, they were clinically dead, but were they really dead? It's going to depend on how you define death. And so to avoid getting into that semantic tangle, Raymond Moody coined the term near death because it seemed indisputable if the person wasn't fully dead, they were at least near death.
Okay, thank you. I need to go back to work, so I just wanted
to... No problem. Thanks for stopping by today.
All right, now let's turn to go ahead and let's do this. So let's turn to the third topic, the third subcategory. Mm-hmm. What do you think? Because we're kind of running out of time here. We've been going for a little while. Okay.
So after-death communications, or ADCs, are an astonishingly common phenomenon. Based on current
Well, Jimmy,
research,
actually, should we mention the fundraiser one more time before we go to talk about the third subcategory?
whatever you'd like to do.
Okay. Yeah, let's do that really quickly. So, as we mentioned at the very beginning of this stream, this whole series of call-in shows this entire week, we've got 5 planned, and we mentioned these, all 5 of them in a video that we posted on Saturday evening. But this whole week is a fundraising week for Capturing Christianity. We're currently operating at a deficit. We started out at a $4,000 deficit, which only gives us, with the amount of money that we have in the bank, roughly another 5 months of operating. And then after that point, if we don't raise the funds, then I will literally just have to find a new source of income to be able to sustain my family. And so we're asking you to support Capturing Christianity right now, and what we're doing to give back to you guys. If you do want to support us, and you can do that at Patreon, patreon.com/Capturing Christianity. Links to that are in the description of the video. If you don't like Patreon, by the way, you can support us through DonorBox. A link to that is actually on our website. Again, linked directly in the description. But what we're giving back to you as a sort of thank you gift, if you do want to support Capturing Christianity and help us continue doing the important work that we're doing, you can. We're going to give you, anyone who signs up gets a PDF of an article that was written by a supporter of the ministry on gospel reliability. It's already available. You can go get that like immediately if you sign up. Then at the $25 tier, we're giving away this book, The Best Argument for God by Pat Flynn, a good friend of mine. He'll be on the show pretty soon to talk about this. And then at the $50 tier, we're giving away this sculpture. Whoops, I knocked my microphone. The sculpture that was created based on the Shroud of Turin. One thing that I haven't shown, it actually even has the scar on Jesus' side here. Yeah, the spear wound. So this is, again, super, super detailed and accurate relative to the wounds that you find actually on the Shroud of Turin. It's 12 inches, made out of bronze and steel, so super high quality. The value of it is around $350. So at the $50 tier, it's a super, super great value of a gift in return. Just, again, as a thank you guys for supporting the ministry. Jimmy, anything to add? Or you can just go directly into the next subcategory.
I just encourage people. We do need to, it's very achievable, but we do need people's help. So use the links in the description below the video to donate either via Patreon or via a donor box, but we really do need your help at this time. And so thank you in advance for all your generosity and for helping keep such sophisticated work being done in the apologetics world here on YouTube.
Oh, yeah. And one thing that we, if you didn't watch the video update that I made with Jimmy, you may not know, and this may be the first time you've heard it, but Jimmy Akin is now on the board of Capturing Christianity. That's one of the reasons why he's joined us for this fundraiser, is because he's basically going to assist us moving forward with the ministry, making sure that we're hitting our fundraising goals on a month-to-month basis. So right now, I think the term that you used, Jimmy, is like this is like a sort of crisis fundraising situation where we're hoping not to be here again. Like we were here a couple years ago, and we're trying to stay out of the situation, bringing Jimmy on board, which he's not getting paid. Like this isn't a paid salaried position that he's just doing this out of the kindness of his heart, literally. So,
because I see the value in the work you're doing. And I want to support it, and this is my way of supporting it. I happen to have a background in fundraising. I've done it for over 20 years. And it involves a special set of skills that not everybody who's a YouTuber necessarily has. And so, what I want to help Capturing Christianity do is get to a position where it's cash positive, so that we don't have to do crisis, deficit fundraising, and we'll only have to do normal, routine, regular fundraising. What we're essentially doing right now is we're catching up on fundraising that ideally we would have done before, but it didn't happen for various reasons. And so now we've got to catch back up. And then in the future, we'll be able to do regular routine fundraising that's not this intense. And, we may have a special project from time to time where we do a little bit more intense fundraising. But one of my goals for, as a board member with Capturing Christianity is to avoid, to the extent possible, having to do crisis fundraising. Now, if a crisis happens, the economy has something bad happen to it or something like that, well, you can't control everything. But the goal is to catch up now and then proceed with a modest regular level of fundraising in the future on an even keel so that we have a steady cash flow that the ministry is able to keep functioning with and even expand into new areas.
Yes. I mean, that's. I even had a friend message me recently. He's like, I want to see Capturing Christianity flourish and do things that we haven't been able to do. And one of those things is actually have like a space where we can sit down and do in-person interviews. I've got another idea for a documentary channel, which I've actually already started, but we're just lacking additional resources to pay editors and all that kind of thing. So once we get out of this situation we're currently in, that's the next step, is to expand and grow and do more things and provide even more valuable content for you guys. But thank you in advance if you're considering joining us and supporting the ministry. Thank you guys so much. It really means a lot. So yeah, so Jimmy, let's talk about after death communications. This is our last subcategory of topics we're discussing today related to the afterlife. So touch on that for a little while, and then we'll turn to some more calls.
Yeah, I'll be really brief about it, but after death communications, or ADCs as they're known, are an astonishingly common phenomenon. You don't often hear about it. And there's the reason for that is basically fear. People are afraid to share the experiences they've had because people will think they're crazy. Well, they might have a different attitude if they knew that 40 to 50% of the population reports having an ADC at least once in their life. ADCs are spontaneous. You know, you're not like going to a medium. You're not trying to make them happen. But a departed loved one will just show up in some form. There's a wide range of different ways this can happen. It can involve just a sense of presence, a kind of knowing, or sentience. Sentire in Latin means to feel. So you could just feel that they're present. It could involve the human senses, and it can involve any of the human senses. A lot of ADCs are olfactory, where you smell, the person or some scent associated with the person. It can involve hearing. You may hear the person's voice. It can involve vision. You may see the person, and you may see them, when you're fully awake in brightly lit conditions and they look totally solid, or they may not look totally solid. So there's a wide range of things that can happen, but there are certain basic messages that tend to be communicated in these experiences. One of them is, I'm fine. Don't worry about me. I'm okay. I'm in a good place. Another is, I'm so sorry for what I did. I want to apologize. That also shows up. Another is, here's some information about the future that the person who's dead may communicate, I'm going to be a grandfather next year, meaning you're pregnant right now and you don't even know it. But the ADC of the father announces to, I was just listening to a case like this yesterday of a woman said, yeah, my father showed up after his death, told me he was going to be a grandfather in a year. I took a pregnancy test the next day and it turned out I was pregnant, and he correctly predicted the sex of the child. There are others that contain, vertical information. One of the things that tends to happen, and these are known as visitations. It's a subcategory of ADCs. Technically, ADCs can happen at any time in life after the person dies. It may be years later. There are some ADCs that occur 15 years, 30 years after the person died. Most of them occur within the first year. But if they occur within 24 hours, they're known as visitations. And there are a lot of times where people will first learn about the death of someone through an ADC. A very famous example, or at least a very prominent one in my estimation, is one where there was a young woman who was asleep with her husband one night, and the two of them were asleep, and she had a dream. And ADCs do sometimes occur in the context of dreams. She had a dream that a friend of hers from high school was wearing a Navy uniform and saying goodbye to her, like he was leaving this life. And when she woke up, she thought, what a strange dream. That doesn't make any sense. My friend went and became a Catholic priest. Well, then, and she hadn't had any contact with this guy in 10 years. So, she was not thinking about him. She didn't have any knowledge of his current situation. Turns out he died on the night she had the dream, and he had become a Catholic Navy chaplain, explaining the uniform she saw him in. So that contained significant veridical information. She didn't have any natural way of knowing that he was going to die. She hadn't had touch with him in 10 years, so she wasn't thinking about him. She didn't know he had joined the Navy, and she was able to learn both about his death and about his Navy chaplaincy through this after-death communication. There are lots of other ones too that contain veridical information. Sometimes they contain warnings for the living. For example, there was one where a woman was staying at a friend's house, and the woman was going to go out to the store, but as she was doing so, as she was just, leaving the door of the house, she heard her mom's voice. Her mom had just died, and her mom's voice said, "You better check the baby." And her friend had a baby. And she thought, well, I'm just grieving. This is just my imagination. And so she started again to leave. And her mom said more emphatically, "You need to check the baby." And so she went back in and she checked on the baby. And the baby who was her friend's child, had become entangled in the blankets in such a way that it couldn't breathe and it was turning blue. And so she gets it out of the blankets, and she's afraid she's going to have to do mouth-to-mouth resuscitation on the baby, when suddenly the baby has this big gasp and then starts crying. So she didn't have to do the mouth-to-mouth, but she had this apparent after-death communication with her mom that told her to go check the baby in the situation where it was needed. Another example of something like that is a woman who was driving along. Her father had died like 15 years earlier, and she's driving along on the outskirts of town, and she in her truck, and she hears a voice which she doesn't initially recognize as her father's, saying, "Stop the truck." And she ignores it, and then the voice says, "Glinda Lee, stop the truck." And that was her name, and she recognized it this time as, "Oh, that's my father's voice. I haven't heard that in 15 years." And she keeps going, and then her father uses her childhood nickname for her and says, "Baby, stop." And so she stops the truck, and immediately upon doing so, here comes a car on a cross street that otherwise would have smashed into her and wrecked her pickup truck and possibly killed her. So in this ADC, she got warning of an imminent accident that she was able to act on and save herself a lot of problems, including possibly her life. So like deathbed visions and near-death experiences, after-death communications also contain veridical information that the experiencers did not know in advance, had no natural way of knowing, could not have guessed by random chance, and that also turned out to be true. And when you look across all of these three categories of experiences and the blendings between them, they all point in the same direction. We've got a lot of research on this that's been done now. I can provide book recommendations for those who'd like. I also have episodes of Mysterious World where I dig into the research on all these topics. And I'm probably next year going to be teaching a course on all this for the Rhine Institute. But it all points in the same direction. And this is scientific research that is done without a religious framework. And yet we have scientific evidence that points towards the existence of an afterlife.
Okay, let's go ahead and bring in, this will likely be our last caller for today. Mm-hmm. And this one, his name is, let's see if I can, Pritam. And hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly. Pritam, please correct me if there's a different way to pronounce your name. Looks like you're muted. Let me see if I can ask you to unmute. There we go.
Yes.
Howdy, Pritam.
Hello. So my question was that there are a lot of experiences, like people meditate, people take like psychedelics, and that is a lot of experiences. But can we reach to conclusions like afterlife or souls on the basis of experiences? Like most of the things that I heard are either anecdotes or something like stories. And it is not like people before LSD or before drugs or before meditation didn't have these experiences. They have these experiences throughout the history. And this specific thing that the experience where you are levitating and the body is like you are out of your body and levitating and seeing your body, that's just doesn't match with the scientific evidence, the like scientific theories, I would say. If we see, if first of all we need to define like what is the soul, then we can proceed. Like when I asked about what is a soul, I got more of an answer that soul is a type of energy. But if it is a type of energy, the entropy of it should increase. And if the entropy increases, then the soul shouldn't exist more than like hour max to max. So even for watching something, even for vision, we need energy. So how can something like we can see levitating, like a body is laying down, our body is laying down, and we are levitating? That's my question.
Okay, Cam, maybe you can help me out. I had a little trouble hearing, and it seemed like there were a number
Yeah,
of different
Pritam,
topics there.
your microphone is a little bit low. Like it's difficult to make out what you said. But tell me if this is roughly what you're getting at. So it sounds like what you're asking is, what is the soul sort of made out of? Because if it's made out of some sort of immaterial substance, why should we be able to see it?
Is
Yes,
that what you're
if
asking?
soul is
Okay.
made out of immaterial substance, it is supernatural. It is not part of a natural world. If you say that it is immaterial, it is not part of a material world. So if it is having an effect in the material world, like we are levitating and seeing our body laying down, how can it provide the energy for that vision? How can the soul be have that energy to see the body? Like even
Okay.
for vision, we need energy, right? So how can we
Pritam,
provide that energy?
I think we got it. Let's let
Okay.
Jimmy have a chance to respond.
So
Yes, sir.
there are, I wish I had a lot more time and the ability to hear a little bit better, to interact with the question. I would not define the soul as supernatural because it's part of human nature. And so it's not supernatural, meaning it's not above human nature. It is immaterial. It's not made out of physical matter, but it is part of us on the Christian worldview. However, parapsychological research, which is scientific in nature, does not tend to use the word soul because it doesn't have it's not scientifically detectable. And so in parapsychology, the typical way it's phrased is not the survival of the soul beyond death, but the survival of consciousness beyond death, because that we do have the ability to speak of in non-religious terms. If someone has a clinical death and then they have conscious experiences after their clinical death and then they get revived, they can tell us about their conscious experiences. How you explain that in terms of, is it a soul, is it something other than a soul, is an open question, and one that we currently don't have the ability to investigate scientifically. So parapsychology tends to stay away to the extent possible from theory-laden terms and use terms that are more descriptive of experiences. Now, in terms of how could, you mentioned a definition of the soul as energy. Well, okay, that's an interesting proposal. I don't know how one would validate that from a scientific perspective. It seems to me, or from a philosophical perspective, it seems to me that that would be more of a religious or a philosophical belief. I would tend, coming from a Christian perspective, not to interpret the soul as a form of energy, because energy, given the standard scientific definition of energy, energy is the capacity to do work. And while souls may be able to do work, that's not the same thing as saying the soul simply is energy. I mean, I have as a human, I have the capacity to do work. And in some sense, my body is made out of energy, since mass and energy are equivalent. but I don't know that the same thing can be said of the soul. So the way I tend to define the soul is simply as the part of us that is conscious that survives the death of the body. That's a fairly neutral description that seems to be phenomenon based. It has consciousness and it survives the death of the body, and whatever has those characteristics, I would say that's a human soul if it's from a human. In terms of how could the human soul affect the body or other objects in the world, the answer, fairly straightforwardly, in a parapsychological perspective, would be psychokinesis, or mind over matter. Psychokinesis happens in various different ways. One way of understanding it is every time I lift my arm, that's psychokinesis, because the command starts in my mind, in my consciousness, and then it travels through the neurology, through the wetware of my body down into my muscles and nerves and so forth. So when I say raise my arm and my arm goes up, that is mind over matter. In this case, we see a physical connection, at least if we trace back from the muscles that are involved in raising my arm to the nerve fibers that lead up to my brain through my spinal cord and into the neurons of the brain. We can trace that part of the physical route. What we can't yet trace is the connection between the neurons in my brain and my mind. There are different theories about how the mind works. Many assume, and this is just an assumption, it is not proved remotely, many assume that the brain generates consciousness. But there is an alternative theory that the brain does not generate consciousness, it transduces consciousness. It enables, it's like a transducer converts one thing into another. And we have transducers all over our bodies. That's what our physical senses are. Our eyes are transducers for light. Our ears are transducers for sound waves and so forth. And they translate that information into neurochemical signals that can go to our brain. Well, what if it turns out our brain is a transducer? It doesn't actually generate consciousness. It just works with consciousness and helps it interface with the physical world. Well, in that case, we've got evidence of the kind we've looked at in today's episode, that the generation model may be false, because if people are able to report conscious experiences when their heart is not beating and they are clinically dead, their brain should not be generating consciousness. And so it looks like the generation model of consciousness, the brain as generator model, is in fact incorrect, at least based on this evidence. And that would then suggest that the brain as transducer model is more likely to be correct, and that consciousness can survive the death of the body and thus the death of the brain, and we end up having an afterlife.
So it looks like we actually lost Pretam. He may have disconnected from Zoom. Yeah, that's unfortunate. Yeah. When you were talking, it made me think about questions about, like, how does the non-physical interact with the physical. It's a pretty standard objection to dualism, to view that there is a soul in addition to a physical body, or that some people say that you are your soul, but there's these sort of two different types of substances, which not everyone holds this view, obviously, as a Christian. But it made me think, like, we could ask that question about a lot of things, and some people kind of get focused on, like, as it relates to the soul when we're thinking about afterlife and all that. But there are still deeper questions, like just scientific questions about, like, why is there any gravity at all? You can understand what gravity does, and you can measure it, and you can create equations that describe what it does. But then there's still a deeper question. We don't even know how does it do it. Yeah, and then how does it even do that? How are two physical things
with mass?
Yeah, how are they related to each other in such a way that they exert force on each other? How is that even how is that even possible? And so, kind of what we do is we come up with these laws, which are basically just descriptions of things that we observe, and we say this is a law, right? And so we can say something similar when it comes to physical and brains and mental activity and stuff. How is that, how are those two things related? How can they be related? And one way to do it is just to say, well, this is what we observe. This is what we see. And so we're just going to kind of say that that's what it is. We put a label on it and say that's what we observe. You can always ask the deeper question about, like, why is it the case that this, is set up this way. But you can ask that about gravity. You can ask it about the strong and nuclear force. You can ask it about all sorts of things that we observe in the world. And sometimes we don't really have an answer to that deeper question. We're just kind of pointing to things that we see, and we don't have answers to all of it. But yeah, that was kind of
that's the stage that parapsychology is largely at today, is observing the phenomena and trying to probe it and test it and describe it, like describing, the fall of a body with an equation, let's say. But not yet at the theoretical stage of, okay, so why does this happen? There are some hints in parapsychology, but it's all very preliminary. Just the way, as you mentioned with gravity, I mean, okay, we believe gravity exists because we can describe the phenomenon with great precision, but we don't actually for sure even know what gravity is. We don't know why it happens. We know it happens between objects that have mass, and Einstein proposed maybe it's like a curvature of space-time, but there are other theories that propose it's not a curvature of space-time. Fun fact about gravity, in Aristotelian physics, there is a rejection of the belief of action at a distance. So two objects cannot have an effect on each other without a physical medium that connects them to transmit the effect. Just like you can't in space, no one can hear you scream. If you scream in space, there's no air to transmit the effect to anybody's ear. And they thought everything works like that. So there's no action at a distance. You have to have a physical medium to transmit effects. And so when Isaac Newton proposed gravity, he was quickly accused of introducing a concept into science, or natural philosophy as it was called, from natural magic, which was one of the two principal divisions. There was ceremonial magic, where you called up a spirit and tried to get it to do stuff for you. And then there was natural magic, where you relied on hidden principles in nature to accomplish effects. And he got accused of being a natural magician for proposing the idea of gravity because it involved action at a distance. You didn't need a medium between two massive bodies for them to have an effect on each other. And this was a source of embarrassment for Newton, but he was describing what he saw, even though he couldn't explain it.
Jimmy, that fact was almost too fun. You called it a fun fact. That argument that I actually mentioned earlier in the stream, psychophysical harmony, that argument, it's somewhat related, because it asks these questions, why are these things related in the exact way that they are? Why do mental states correlate with certain physical states in the brain in just the right way, and it's in a way that sort of makes sense. And you can always ask that deeper question. I mean, theists have, I think, probably one of the better responses to that is to say that this is how God set things up, and he values certain things, and in order to create a world like he wants to create, he's got to set up these sorts of rules in place, or regularities in place. And so I think theists may actually be in a better position to answer some of those questions, even with respect to the laws of nature. Why does gravity exist? Well, life actually requires gravity. Like, imagine if there was no gravity, nothing that was holding together composite objects, or larger composite objects, like
planets. Gravity works on the planetary scale, but what actually holds our physical bodies together is not gravity. It's the
right. Yeah, that's why. Yeah, I was. I tried to sort of correct it, but if there was no gravity, there would be no planets, right? And so people we wouldn't have been able to evolve on just in floating in outer space, and you really can't. Yeah. Anyways, I guess that's all I had to say on that. But let's do this before we close out. We did have a couple more super chats sent in, so we'll cover those and then we'll close out for today. So this one, we should be able to get through these fairly quickly. Modern Day Debate. He says, awesome show idea. Very fun to listen to. That's great news. I actually anticipated that these would do pretty well. And I'm excited about the rest of the shows. I mean, having Jimmy on is always a lot of fun, but I'm super excited about the rest of the shows that we have lined up. So tomorrow, if you guys are watching this live tomorrow, we've got Cy Gart. He's coming on to talk with you guys about biology. So he's a retired biochemist, but he came to faith later in life through science. And so he's going to be talking about those connections that he's seen from science to God, and then you're going to be able to bring any objections you've got. So that one's going to be a lot of fun. So let's turn to another super chat from Truth Seeker. Jimmy, what do you think? What do you think is the most well done scientific study on NDEs? If you had to pick one, the specific study, if you have like a name, I guess.
What I have is books that summarize the results of studies. Now, there is a promising study or pair of studies. I mentioned them earlier, the AWARE study and the AWARE 2 study. And I think they're innovative and trying to do good stuff, but I don't think they're fully successful in that they haven't been used. They don't have a robust enough data collection to provide confidence in high confidence in the results. When you're doing a scientific study, you need to have a certain number of things to study in order to provide power for your results. And I think that the AWARE studies have been disappointing in that they didn't have enough cases to study to provide the power that would provide the kind of data that they need to answer the questions they're looking at. So I think thus far, the AWARE studies have been something of a disappointment. And there are also some plausible objections to the way they're going about it. I was talking with one out-of-body experiencer who can consciously induce out-of-body experiences, and he thought the AWARE studies iPads were a terrible idea, that's not what a person having an out-of-body experience is going to be focusing on. And so I think there are some potential criticisms that may need to be taken into account in future experimental design. But there are quite a number of good books to recommend. I recommend works by Bruce Grayson. In fact, it's not a study, but Bruce Grayson recently published a book called After, in which he summarizes the results of a bunch of different studies, as well as his own history as a near-death experience researcher. So I'd recommend After by Bruce Grayson. Pim van Lommel, has a Dutch researcher, has also done a bunch of good stuff on NDEs. And of course, you can always read Raymond Moody's classic book that kicked it off, Life After Life, but that's just the baby stage. And if you're particularly interested in evidential cases, then I would recommend Titus Rivas and others' book, The Self Does Not Die, which, as I mentioned, has over 100 cases of vertical NDEs that have independent validation of some form.
Cool. All right. We have another super chat that was sent out. I don't even know what this means, though. It was a 99-cent.
100 underlined twice.
Awesome. Thank you. I don't know what that means.
Seems positive. Thank you.
But appreciate it. Jimmy, okay, one thing I did want to ask you before we close out, there was a comment in our other video we did the other day. Where are you from? Are you from the South? Because your accent is starting to get more country.
Yeah. So I was born in Texas, but raised in Arkansas, in Fayetteville, which is up in the Ozarks. And then I moved to California and spent 30 years living in California. And I deliberately suppressed Southern elements in my speech. But now I've moved back to my hometown of Fayetteville, and I'm re-embracing Southern elements of speech. So my accent currently is still in a little bit of flux, because after 30 years, you don't just shake habits overnight. But my internal monologue has shifted substantially to Southern. So when I talk in my head, I'm hearing myself talk with a Southern accent more. And currently there are elements in it of Texas, which is not surprising since that's where my family was from, and nearby regions like Oklahoma and Arkansas. It'll eventually settle out into a standard Ozark accent, but those are some of the influences that you hear in it right now.
Gotcha. Do you have time to take one more super chat? One was sent in by a guy who was in the room, but he, I think his video wasn't on. So let's go ahead and pull up his question, though. All right. He says, Anthony says, do you think that any types of after-death communications point to the existence of purgatory? In a discussion with my friend, I opined that ghosts are empirical evidence of purgatory having a temporal element.
Well, okay. So there's kind of two different questions here. One is the existence of purgatory, and the other is, does purgatory take time? answer to the first question is I think that there are various types of after-death communications. Now, when we use the term ADC, you have some connection with the person. It's not like they're a stranger. So this is different than what's known as an apparition. Apparition is a more general term where someone who you may not know at all appears to you. There is both information from after-death communications and as I mentioned, even from deathbed visions. But there is information from after-death communications and apparitions that that there is a process of purification that happens for people in the afterlife who need to be purified, so that we won't, be going through eternity struggling with sin and temptation. And so we have evidence of, people coming back to ask forgiveness or ask for prayers or things like that. In fact, this is very well attested in Christian history. In fact, the person who coined the term poltergeist, which is German for noisy ghost, was Martin Luther. Apparently, he's the first person we have on record using the term poltergeist. And he was not a fan of the Catholic Mass, and he says that if you have a spirit that is apparently moving things in your house, it's and you talk to it, don't believe what it says because it's a tricky spirit. It's deceptive because all of these poltergeists want Mass said for them, which is classically one of the things that people would do for their departed loved ones, is they would have Mass said for them to help with their purification process. Well, Luther didn't like that idea, and so he concluded that any spirit asking for prayers and Mass must be a deceptive spirit, because he didn't like the idea of purgatory. And that's how he got the term poltergeist. But I would say that's Martin Luther's view, and I respect that. But we actually do see people in after-death experiences saying things like, please forgive me, I'm sorry for what I did, please pray for me, please have Mass said for me, and other things like that. In terms of, so I think there is evidence in these communications, both in ADCs and in apparitions, for purgatory or some kind of purification. That's all I mean by purgatory. I'm not presupposing a particular theory of how it works, but some kind of purification I think we have evidence for. In terms of, does it take time? Well, maybe, but God is also capable, as John tells us, of transforming us in a twinkling of an eye. I tend to support the way Benedict XVI expressed it in his letter Spe Salvi, where he says that the duration of this purgatory or purification can't be calculated in earthly time, because we don't really know how time works in the afterlife. So it could be instantaneous, it could be stretched out over time. And I would say the interactions between those in the afterlife who come back after a period of time saying, I still need prayers or something, well, that could provide that, at least facially or on its face, sounds like purgatory takes time. But I don't know. It could be more complex than that. Since I'm not in the afterlife yet, I try to leave as much about it as open as possible, and I'll find out for sure when I get there.
You're not in the afterlife yet.
Which
I like that. Okay.
hopefully won't be that soon.
Yeah. So introverted Christian, this isn't a super chat, but now I'm curious. Can Jimmy do an English accent?
Well, I'm sure I could if I studied how to do it, but I don't. I would probably be very bad at it off the top of my head. I could probably fake elements of it, but not robustly.
Are you into accents at all?
I'm into linguistics.
Do you like doing them?
And,
okay.
Well, I'm into linguistics, and there are some accents I just can do. Some years ago, I developed a person actually from India might find fault in it, because India is now the most populous country in the world. China isn't anymore. And it's a
when
vast
did that take
country,
place?
just a few years ago. And because China has had that one birth child policy, it's like, dudes, you're ensuring your own demographic winter, and you're going to get overtaken. And India doesn't have a one child policy, so they overtook China. But it's a big country with different languages, but at least to American ears, I can do an Indian accent just fine on occasion, And if I settle into it for a few minutes, it becomes better. But because that was a rapid transition.
Yeah.
But I can do an Indian accent. What I find more interesting though is linguistics, and I study different aspects of it. Like for example, with the Ozark accent, one of the markers for that is
Wait. Ozark accent? What is that?
Yeah, well, the accent that is commonly characteristic of people in the Ozark Mountains, which is where Fayetteville is. That's where I'm from.
Okay. Okay. Is it just like a country?
It's a subvariant. It's a subvariant, though there are multiple Southern accents and multiple country accents. And so the one that I used to speak with while I was in California was technically a Mountain Western accent, which would indicate...
none of what you said earlier is blowing my mind. This is blowing my mind.
Well, so a Mountain Western accent is characteristic of places like Colorado and Utah and places like that. So I didn't have a full California accent, but it incorporated blends that tended to make it sound Mountain Western. Here in the South, there are a bunch of different accents that are variations on each other. And mine is slightly free floating, but one of the elements I anticipate will emerge with time is the Ozark I sound, which is it's sort of a diphthong between the ah sound and the I sound in regular English. So in regular English, if you said mine, in Southern English, more broadly, you would get mine. And in Ozark English, you get a little bit of a blend. It's more like mine. So it has part of the ah sound and part of the I sound together. A classic phrase using that would be like my wife. You can hear how there's some I in when I say my wife, but there's also some ah in it as well. And it's based on the position of the tongue towards the back of the mouth. Another characteristic of Ozark speech is the pen transition, where before
the what? So the pin.
Yeah, and I have trouble saying it because it's so natural to me. I grew up with it. So you can pronounce the word pen, pen. You pronounce the word pin, pin. And in Ozark English, you tend to have words with that first spelling and first sound transforming into an I sound. So you would have pen pronounced pen in Arkansas English, just the way you have pin pronounced pin. That's called the pin transition, and it happens a lot in Ozark English. Whenever you have that sound before a nasal vowel, a nasal consonant. So that's like M and N. Also in Ozark English, final plosives. A plosive is a letter that is a consonant that is sometimes pronounced with a kind of aspirated pop, like P.
It's the reason we have these.
Yeah, pop filters. P, T, D, K, elements like that. And it's final if it's the final sound in a word. Well, in Arkansas English, they tend to be de-emphasized so that they don't have the pop. And you still can hear the sound most of the time, but you don't hear the pop. And if it is
give me an example. Give me an example of the plosive, lacking the plosive.
Oh, let me pull one up real quick, just because I have another one I'll tell you about in a second. But here we go. Actually, pop. I know what I want. Yeah. Well, pop itself involves two different P sounds that we don't distinguish in English, but they do in some Indian languages. You can hear, if you think about it ever so subtly, the P on the front of pop is different than the P on the end of pop. The P on the end of pop has that more plosive element, pop. You know, it's... So there's actually two different P sounds there, but we don't distinguish between them. We also have, and this is really freaky for a lot of people, but we have a hidden consonant in English that almost nobody knows about because we don't have a letter for it. But it's a genuine consonant, just as genuine as B and K and D and M and all of those things. It's just we don't have a letter for it, so we don't recognize it. It's a glottal stop, the sound. And that qualifies as a consonant because a consonant is when you constrict or stop the flow of air, as opposed to a vowel where you don't. And so we have this whole hidden consonant in English that we tend to use on the front of words that begin with vowels. We say apple with a glottal stop, not apple with no glottal stop. And some languages, unlike English, have a character for that letter. In Arabic, the character for the glottal stop is a hamza. It's also the last letter in the Arabic alphabet. So alif is the first letter, hamza is the last letter. And so to Arabic Christians, Jesus is the alif u hamza. But we just don't, we have the sound in English. We just don't have the name for it or a character for
in
it.
the example you gave was apple?
Apple, yeah. You can feel how you constrict your throat just before you say that A.
Yeah. Instead of apple, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Apple.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So let me see. You asked about an example of final plosives.
Ending on a plosive.
Lamp, mop, web, cube, bat, boat.
Okay.
And the T will drop out entirely if it's part of a final consonant cluster. If there's more than one, and it's true of other stops too. If you have a cluster of consonant sounds and the final one is a plosive, it tends to drop out altogether. That's why and becomes an. Jim and Joan came over, not Jim and Joan came over.
It's almost like English. English has a lot of the end of the words are missing, or a lot of the the letters are just completely missing in English.
There's also one of the marked characteristics of like Cockney English is they have very pronounced glottal stops with medial T's. So medial means in the middle of a word. And so you'll have a little bottle become a little bottle. And they have these really pronounced glottal stops. That actually is similar to a characteristic in Ozarks English where medial T's sort of get transitioned into glottal stops, but they're not as pronounced. They're not like Cockney. But anyway, those are some aspects of this form of speech, but each dialect has its own rules and everybody's got an accent. It's just a question of which one are you using. And when you switch
I'm absolutely
between them,
positive that go ahead, finish your thought.
And when you switch between them, it's known as code switching. And loads of people do code switching depending on who they're talking to.
Yeah, that's probably true. And a lot of people just don't even recognize that that's what they're doing.
Yeah.
That's what they're doing. Maybe with you, Jamie, I'll start to bring out my southern accent.
Happy
I'll
if you want
switch
to.
around you. No, I actually do like to do accents. I don't do them a whole lot. Some friends, I guess, I do them more. But yeah, no, I was gonna say this is probably exactly the sort of content that people are tuning in during the show for. Is talking about linguistics and. Man,
well, people like get interested in other stuff. I mean, I get all kinds of questions and comments about my beard and, what kind of pipe tobacco do I smoke and my accent and all those kind of things. So people are naturally curious, and I'm try to be an open book.
For sure. Okay. I do want to just, I can hear the dog too, if you guys can hear it. Someone just dropped off a package. So, you weren't hearing it. Good. Great. Excellent.
Yeah.
But all right. So
before we go, we need to remind folks, we need your help. That's the whole point of this week. We hadn't been able to do fundraising for a while that we needed to. So now we're in catch-up mode because we are in a deficit situation. In 5 months, the bank account would be empty at current rates. But the good news is we got 5 months to fix it, and it's a fixable problem. We just need an extra $4,000 a month, which is just 160 people donating at $25 a month. So that, given all the thousands of people who watch these videos, is an achievable goal. And we've already made some progress towards it just from the video that was effectively released Sunday. I know technically it was Saturday night, but it was really late Saturday night.
Yeah.
And we've
it depends on
already
the time zone as well.
Yeah. But you know, we've made some progress. We're not over the hump yet. We do need to hear from you, and you can do. We have thank you gifts for you. We mentioned everybody who donates during this drive gets the PDF of the Gospel Reliability article. If you donate at the $25 a month level, you get Pat Flynn's book, The Best Argument from God, which has received very high praise. And if you donate at the $50 a month level, you get the sculpture of Jesus based on the Shroud of Turin that is made out of like bronze and iron. So it is durable.
Steel.
It's
bronze and steel.
Bronze and steel. Well, steel is iron. It's carbonized iron. So yeah, it's meant to be durable. You can hang it on your wall. You can put it on your desk, on your bookcase, whatever you want. The versions that we'll send out to people will have a hole in the back so that you can hold it on a hanger on the wall, just like you would a painting.
And it's very substantial.
It's also 12 inches tall. It's 12 inches tall if you want to get an estimate of how big it is. So we have those thank yous. Please do use the patron links. You'll find those at the top of the video description, just below where my beard gets cut off by the frame. And if you don't like using Patreon, we also have Donor Box for you. So whatever your preferences is, we try to make it as easy as possible. Kevin was on earlier, Kevin Non-Tradicath, who's an agnostic. He mentioned it took him like 60 seconds to sign up. And so it's a very easy process. And by the way, you know, he's an agnostic, but he still sees the value of the work that's being done here on Capturing Christianity and wanted to support it. So that's a real testimony. If even people who don't share your perspective see the value of what you're doing and want to help you keep doing it, that's important. And as I've said, what happens here on Capturing Christianity is rare. There are not a lot of oases on the vast swamp of YouTube to find intellectual content that is objective and trying to be neutral and open-minded and fair-minded to the different positions, and that tries to steel man the arguments from other positions. In fact, straw men are the rule on the internet. Steel manning is very rare, and especially with the kind of charity that you see on this channel. So this is a rare resource. It really needs to keep going. And for that, we need your help. And thank you in advance for the help that you're able to provide.
Thank you, guys. And thank you, Jimmy. I'm really excited about Friday. Friday is going to be a lot of fun. We're talking about aliens and demons and whether or not aliens are just demons. It's a really popular hypothesis among Christians, a lot of Christians actually. And so that's the topic for Friday. There's a reason we're covering that too. It's not just to play up the hype or anything like that. This is a constant thing in the media right now, is discussing aliens. There's a lot of stuff that's come out recently about whether or not there are extraterrestrials or non-human intelligence. NHI is the more modern term that's being used right now, but there's a reason. I mean, we as Christians need to be talking about this, and also exorcisms as well. They're, as you mentioned, Jimmy, they're starting to increase in number, and there's a reason that we're interviewing more exorcists, and these topics are super important. So we need to talk about them. But I'm really excited to have you back on. We'll see you soon.
Okay, see you soon.
Okay, thank you guys for watching. Thank you for your support, and I will see you guys tomorrow. So if you weren't able to call in today, call in tomorrow. Links will be in the description of tomorrow's video. And see you guys soon. Hey, it's me again. Actually, don't leave yet. I've got something super, super important to tell you. So first of all, you're awesome. Like you just watched a really, really long video just now, and you're still watching it. That is actually pretty amazing. Secondly, we have literally hundreds of other apologetics related videos for you to watch on our channel. Go check them out. I've interviewed exorcists, hosted debates between Christians and atheists. I've even made response videos to atheists. All of that is available on our channel. Go check it out. Third, I rely on people that see value in my work, people like you that watch videos to the very end, to keep the lights on around here. Literally, this is how I feed my family. So if you see value in the work that I do, please consider supporting this ministry and becoming a patron. Links to that are in the description. Oh, and have I mentioned that Christianity is true?